Thank you very much, Arturo. Thank you for this invitation. When the opportunity to be here with colleagues so distinguished whose work I've been reading in the past years. Now, the nature of online Zoom talks is very different. So this will be a much shorter than a standard paper. And also it will be somewhat unusual in the way I present it. So I thought I'll really start with a vignette, and then I will try to draw some general points out of this vignette, and then I will end it. Now, the vignette comes from an investigation which has just concluded in Sicily. So people have just been arrested recently, and it's an investigation into a particular mafia group, a mafia family, which is part of the Sicilian mafia. And it's called the Pagliarelli clan, the Pagliarelli family. I should, of course, warn you that the people are still innocent until proven guilty. Now they're going to trial for this. So we are not assuming anything in terms of criminal responsibilities. So the Pagliarelli family is one of the most significant mafia families in Sicily. It's part of what you would call the mafia aristocracy. It's been run by a man called Nino Rotolo. I wrote about him in my book, Mafia Life. And this was a family that was allied with Totò Riina in the famous war, which pitted the Riina Corleone faction against the rest of the Sicilian mafia. This also is where some of the most gruesome crimes were committed within this family, and Pagliarelli is also the name of the court of the prison in Palermo. Is a very central, very important family. Now, the vignette I'm going to talk about is, as I said, out of this investigation, which has targeted the new boss, allegedly the new boss of the family after Rotolo. And the vignette takes place in the summer of 2019, so very recently. Now, let me start the vignette. The vignette starts with the following phone call intercepted by the police. There is an entrepreneur, a man who owns several shops that sell domestic goods, and he has, I think, several of them in Palermo, and he calls the deputy head of the family, a man which we call Giovanni, and he says, this is the phone call, Giovanni, could you make me a big favor? Could you come up to the shop in Pagliarelli now? And Giovanni replies on the phone, sure, I'll come right away. And he does, right? And this Giovanni runs to the shop. Now, a few months later, a very similar phone call from another entrepreneur is made to the same guy and the same mechanism. I have a problem, come up, I need to talk to you. And Giovanni, the deputy head of the family, runs to talk to the second entrepreneur. Now, what are the conversations about? So the first conversation, it's about the entrepreneur who owns several shops in the city, who has been the victim of a theft, right? So there were some thugs who went to steal from the shop, and it happened twice in a matter of a few days. Now, who does this entrepreneur, who belongs to the wealthy middle class, entrepreneurial class of the city of Palermo, calls? Who does he call in order to find the guilty party? He calls not the police. It doesn't even cross his mind to call the police. He calls the boss, in this case, the deputy boss of the Pagliarelli clan. When the guy comes, he shows him all the videos, CCTVs, he shows all the information, and in a matter of a week, the guy, the boss of the family, finds the culprits, calls them aside, brings them to a particular part of Palermo, and he beats them up violently and forces them to return the money and punish them and tortures them. And the entrepreneur, at least according to the investigation, is also present at the event. The second phone call, which I mentioned to you at the beginning, it's about the owner of a very central bar, a very central cafe and restaurant, very chic, very nice restaurant in the center of Palermo. In this case, he calls because somebody who works in this establishment got his, in this case, I think it's a woman, her car stolen. Again, never crosses his mind to call the police. He calls the boss, in this case, the deputy boss. And of course, the boss is behind and is eventually present. And within 5 days, the car is returned to the owner of the car. So what are these? These are events that happened very recently. And what do they tell us, I think? Well, these are examples of entrepreneurs searching for mafia protection, a mafia service of dispute settlement and recovery of stolen goods. These are people who have human and social capital, you could say, because they could go to the police. They have got, certainly they are wealthy people. And we're not talking about major events in their life. I mean, it's a stolen car, you know. But instead of waiting this and going through the police route, they go to the mafia, and the mafia is very quick to solve the problem. Now, there is no question here that the mafia provides a genuine governance, a genuine service, because there is no question in the investigation that the people who had stolen the car, who had robbed the shops, have been connected to the mafia in any case. These are independent thieves, independent of the mafia, who have come to the rescue. Now, of course, the mafia does much more than this. And as it comes through the investigation, it also organizes competition. So imagine that there is, in the investigation, which is extremely rich, extremely fascinating for our topic, there is a guy who's has got a high building, and somebody in the building has got a shop, and the guy who runs the shop is not paying rent. He's not paying rent in time to the owner of the shop. Again, what does the owner of the shop? Goes to the boss, and eventually there is a meeting between the guy who runs the shop, the owner of the building, and even a notary, a public notary, to settle the dispute over this unpaid rent. It's not an easy dispute, because the guy who doesn't pay rent claims that the owner has not done some work in the house. Furthermore, there is another dispute, and then I end it here in this list of cases. Another dispute which has got to do with a guy who has got a pizzeria and he wants to expand it and make it into a restaurant, into a fancy restaurant. But not far from this establishment, there is another establishment who also sells good food. And so the issue here is, well, I'm going to expand my business, but the question is that you have to check with the guy next door is happy for me to do so. And so in this case, again, the mafia boss intervenes and makes sure that the guy on next door is happy. And he also forces the entrepreneur to hire a company for this expansion that he has suggested. And then eventually the issue is settled. So not only there is a retrieval of stolen goods, not only there is dispute settlements over rent, but there is also a management of the competition, competition control. Now the magistrates, the investigating magistrates that have written up this document, which of course is thousands of pages, write that mafia, Cosa Nostra ensures, are you still following me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Something happened on my computer. The Cosa Nostra ensures public order of the territory. That's the expression used by the magistrates, by the prosecuting magistrate. So you have got here some key concepts in political theory: public, order, territory, which are clearly the domain of the state. And yet what the prosecutors say is that the public order of the territory is managed by the mafia. Now, there are a few interesting things about this particular mafia family. As you know, the mafia has been under huge pressure in Sicily from the prosecution. And you can see that even in this particular case, despite the fact that the mafia is still functioning, I would argue, as a very effective governance structure, which is very threatening and very sort of disturbing. The boss who has been arrested in this investigation was born in 1977. So he's pretty young. The previous boss, which was arrested in 2009, was born in 1981. While the guy that I studied in my mafia life book called Rotolo, when he became head of the mafia clan, was 57. So you see bosses becoming younger and younger, and many of them, of course, are in prison. Now, there are a lot of wonderful anecdotes of how the mafia outside prison provides, of course, a stipend for those who are in prison and to the families, but also ensures very good quality, high quality food, in particular fish, to those in prison, which obviously means that prison as such does not detract from the public standing and even from the good food that you can have as a mafia member. Now, there is another point which has been picked up a lot in the news reporting on this particular case, which is somewhat confusing, I think, the matter. So one of the key elements of governance is that you have to control the territory. So you cannot govern if you are not in the territory. You cannot govern the Pagliarelli neighborhood if you sit in Brazil. Now, believe it or not, this guy who was arrested in 2021, just now, is allegedly the boss of the family, was in Brazil for 1 year. Was in Brazil for 1 year, which is exactly the year of COVID. So he had gone to Brazil in 2020, apparently to make some sort of deals over some housing, estate and speculations. But then he basically got stuck in Brazil and he couldn't come back as soon as he wanted. And so he was there. It's also possible that he went to Brazil in order to avoid imminent arrest because he had the feeling that the police was after him. So I think that also proves another important point, that governance is done on the territory. And if you go away from the territory, it's because you are being pursued by the police or because you are weak, not because you somehow are a floating liquid governance structure. So that's the second point I wanted to make. Now, I think it's not, obviously the debate is very complex. We cannot simply make a simple equation, you know, the state is inefficient, the mafia is more efficient. I think it's a more complex equation than that, but for sure, the state is very inefficient in settling basic disputes in Italy, and particularly in parts of Italy. So in Italy, a civil case takes 527 days to be settled. In a dispute over labor rights in a city nearby Palermo took almost 12 years to be settled. I just read today in the Italian press, a lady in another part of Italy had a dispute with her employer. It took 11 years to be settled. In the meantime, she died. So certainly what you have here is the mafia as being not just a criminal entity. The mafia is a social and economic and political phenomenon. It is also a governance structure, governs relationships, governs the economy. And the economy is not properly governed by the institutions of the state. And it governs it in some sort of efficient way. I mean, obviously not perfect, but compared to the alternative, it seems that is what people who seem to have social capital and resources seem to be favoring. So that is an extremely significant and I think a worrying situation. Now, I think there are two more things I wanted to say, which I might have just probably 5 minutes to say. The first one is that during COVID, there has been an issue in Sicily, but also in other parts of Italy, but especially in Latin America, which is why I'm looking forward to hear the other speakers. An issue that the mafia is not just about crime, it's also about legitimacy. It's also about trying to exert its legitimacy on the neighborhood. And the mafia has been seen as giving out food parcels. Now, this is a kind of a fake pretense, because obviously the kind of support the mafia can give to the neighborhood is very limited. And yet they wanted to give the impression that they were helping the community. In this particular investigation, there is an instance in which one of the people connected to the family ensures that 5,000 face masks are given out within the neighborhood. This was quite a hidden episode because it wasn't reported in the press, but it comes through the investigation. So you see that legitimacy is one of the very important commodities that the mafia wants to acquire. It's not just about stealing and thieving. And you can see that through the history of the mafia. If you go back to the crisis of the 1929 in the United States, the Al Capone opened up a soup kitchen for the poor people of Chicago and gave out food. Bonanno in his biography also explains how in 29 the mafia came to the rescue of entrepreneurs by then lending money and eventually, of course, buying up their own company. So I feel that and also, of course, you can see that in other mafias. You can see that in other mafias, the Yakuza in Japan. That's probably the part of the title of my talk when I said Sicily and beyond. The mafia in Japan, the Yakuza, as being known to help during earthquakes, and also has been offering help in this particular instance of the COVID situation. And and again, it's not for me to talk about this, but you've seen this in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, what is normally called a cartel. This was the case in Mexico, for instance, giving out food to the members. So I don't want to take too much time. I think I made my point that you can still see today that the mafia is still performing this function of governance. I also want to finish on a nice note for me. I recently won a grant from the European Union called ERC, and I got an advanced grant. And in this project, I plan to study further the governance dimension of organized crime alongside other two dimensions of organized crime, which I highlight as being the production of goods and the trade of goods. So I want to spend the next 5 years of my academic life working further on the dimension of governance, but also recognize that organized crime as a general label has got more than just governance. Of course, governance is a key element of it, but it's not the only one. And I think we see in some parts of the world, and some people are specializing in the production of illegal goods, some specialize in the trading of these goods, in the trafficking side. And yet, I want to end on this, we must remember that markets do not self-regulate. Markets are regulated by some authority, either legitimate authorities or through mafia violence. And when the state is incapable, inefficient to do so, you can see under special conditions, and not everywhere, otherwise we would fall into a functionalist fallacy, you can see other actors coming up to do the governance. It's either the mafia or corrupt agents of the state. And I thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Arturo, for the invitation. This is a great group of people that I admire greatly. So it's fantastic to be here, and also followed Federico's great presentation, which was also very timely. So I'm going to try to be as precise as Federico was with the time. So let me just share my screen. And what I'm going to do in this presentation, it's on the one hand, I think I want to just make some broad reflections about how we can think about criminal governance, or, some of the challenges of thinking about criminal governance in Latin America, especially in this new millennium. And then the last part of the presentation, I'll try to talk specifically from a comparative perspective, looking at two cases, which I think actually reflect, these are two cities in Colombia where I've been doing research for a long time. And that I think actually suggests that criminal governance, and I think this may complicate a little bit some of the things that Federico said that I agree with, but I also, in the case of Latin America, for example, I'm not sure that we can say that all organized crime exerts governance, or at least governs in the same way. And I try to look at this through a very brief examination of two cases in Colombia. So, of course, and I think this is probably very well known for everybody in this workshop, but for some of the people in the audience. So when we think about governance in Latin America and criminal governance in Latin America, of course, we have to think about it in the context of knowing that Latin America is the region in the world that has one of like the highest rates of homicide and some the highest rates of criminal violence. So these are according to a UNDC statistics, how the Americas, this is not separating Latin America, but Americas has far higher homicide rates than any other region of the world and that the global average. Of course, there are some complications that we can talk about statistics, but I think for the most part, this is a reality that we know. Latin America represents only about 9% of the world population, but about 30% of the homicides in the world. And we know also that this is something that has happened, that this violence has been increasing, particularly throughout the new millennium, throughout the 2000s. And however, it is not as constant as we sometimes believe it is, but if you look in red here are the homicide rates for Latin America, and you see, throughout the 19s, there was kind of a decline, and then starting the early 2000s, we start seeing like an increase with peaks and valleys. So this is where if we think about Latin America today in terms of criminal governance and criminality and organized crime, we have to think in this context, right? That violence has been increasing. Of course, these homicides are determined by many causes, and this varies a lot across the region. But it's clear that criminality and organized crime are one of the forces and one of the important forces behind explaining this level of violence in Latin America. But again, we also have to keep in mind that there are differences across countries, right? So if you see the red is the trend for the Americas as a whole, you look at the homicide rate in Colombia, it has been declining, but of course we have to keep in mind that it has been declining, but it's still much higher than the average for the region, right? So these are two different scales, right? So as of 2018, the average homicide rate for the region was about 15 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. For Colombia, it's still around like 28 or so. So it's still much higher. But the point I'm trying to make here is that within this trend that we see across the region, there are very important differences across countries. And just to show you another example here is the example of Venezuela, which is probably the country that has seen also this more clear increase in homicides and in criminal violence throughout the 2000s. And you see Venezuela here is in red. And you see kind of, again, the same thing, kind of peaks and valleys, but a clear tendency towards the increase in violence and particularly in criminal violence. So this is all just to say, in this context, we know that there is a clear trend in the region, a trend, however, that is not necessarily always constant or new, and that changes across countries, but that I think has increased an interest and an emphasis in better understanding what's going on and what do these groups, armed groups that are present in the region, how do they behave? And I think to understand also this broader trend, there are this broader trend of growing and constant criminal violence in the region. We have to consider two elements that some people will say are new. I always put a question mark at the end because I don't think they are necessarily entirely new, but they are important. So one of these trends is the geographic expansion of organized crime. So what we have seen in Latin America throughout the 2000s is that many more countries, many more locations that did not necessarily have like a strong presence of organized crime or of criminal groups have seen an increase. And we can think, for example, certain regions in Argentina being a country that doesn't have like a very high levels of violence, has seen increases in certain parts of the country, countries like Ecuador. And at the same time, we've seen an intensification in other areas that have had a more historic presence of organized crime, but that also have seen this kind of trend towards expansion in terms of presence. We have also seen a trend towards market diversification. And I will say this is also, this is probably much more recent. Again, this is, and I think it's very important, there is always a little bit of a historian in me, like trying to be very cautious of not exaggerating new trends. But it is clear that we do have a tendency towards market diversification. And we see we see this market diversification very clearly, for example, in border areas of different countries. The border region between Colombia and Venezuela has tons of different criminal economies. The border region between Mexico and the US, for example, where we see not only the drug trade, but also like many other activities, both legal and illegal, not only illegal markets, but also legal ones. And I will say that this is also attached to a new trend. I think this is the one that is most exaggerated in terms of how new it is, but I think it does play a role in understanding why we see like a growth trend in Latin America, which is a growth in local drug markets. I think this is the trend that tends to be exaggerated more easily because I don't think this is necessarily new in all the cases, but because there has been, for different reasons, a growth in local drug market that has also led to the growth of groups and organized crime, manifestations of crime in different places. So in this context, of course, there is we also know that there is not only this problem with violence, but that we see that the groups that are present throughout the region, which are very varied in nature, they all engage in different forms of criminal governance, and this is what, some of them engage in forms in criminal governance, and there has been an increasing interest on that. But I guess that to really understand how that's happening, and besides the trends that I just mentioned, the other trend that I think is crucial to understand the trends of criminality in Latin America has to do with politics and with political transformations. So unless, like I just mentioned, geographic diversification, market diversification, but unless we also take into consideration the political transformations, our understanding about what are the trends of criminal governance in Latin America today is incomplete. And I will say that perhaps these politics, I will argue, is actually even more important than the actual trends of markets. So in the most prominent cases in the region, we see clearly that the key variable explaining changes in the dynamics and in the logics of crime has to do with politics. So in Mexico, of course, it was the decline of the centralized control of the PRI, which was kind of one of the catalysts for changes that we have seen in the behavior of criminal groups that used to be protected and kind of centrally organized in a very close collusion with the state. When that state loses power, then we start seeing, is one of the factors, right? I will say it's kind of the necessary condition for many other things to happen. And in Venezuela, which is, as I was showing before, the other country where the country where I will say we've seen like the more clear deterioration. Venezuela, of course, has been a country that has seen a deterioration of democracy, and that's crucial. But I will say that more than the actual deterioration of democracy, a crucial factor in explaining why Venezuela has been a country that has become so besieged by different forms of criminality and high levels of violence is because there has been a very deep fragmentation of the state, which seems paradoxical when we talk about state that is becoming more authoritarian in some ways. But when you look at the structure of police forces, of politics, of the military in Venezuela, it's a very fragmented space. And, you know, we can talk more about that in the discussion, but these processes of fragmentation of the state have been crucial to understand in which cases we've seen like a more clear deterioration of public security and also changes in the way that criminal groups behave. But I think what is crucial here, and in some ways, I think how Federico said very clearly, right? Like these groups and organized crime mafias are gonna operate where the state is weak. But I will say that this is a complicated relationship too, right? Like it's weak in some areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's absent or that these criminal manifestations are only emerging in the margins of the state, because the state and the state actors, maybe not functional states, but state actors are crucial in understanding how groups are behaving and how criminal groups behave in different territories. And these relationships between states and criminals actually have a very wide range of variation. They go from, you know, a strong confrontation to collusion and collaboration. And As I will say in a second, I think one of the challenges that we have when we try to understand criminal governance is really understanding what's the relationship between these forms of a state criminal relation and the way that criminal groups or criminal actors or armed actors operate in a territory. And of course, just going back to the specific goal of this workshop, let me just say a few things about criminal governance. And hopefully these are more, I will say, just snippets of things that I think we really need to consider. And this is based in my knowledge of Latin America. So of course we know, and as Federico and Arturo were saying at the beginning, when we think about criminal governance, we're thinking about a range of regulation of behaviors, right? And imposing rules. And those go from regulating communities and regulating behaviors, mediating disputes, providing services, trying to create some form of order, taxing communities, right? What's interesting here, and then when we think about what are some of the factors that are associated with explaining why criminals do this or criminal groups do these things. So as I was saying, one key factor is the relation with the state. So in some ways, as Federico was saying, it makes sense to think that criminal groups will regulate more when the state is weaker in regulating, right? But it is also paradoxical, because when you look, for example, in Latin America, militias that tend to be closer to the state and are generally collude with the state also seem to be some of the actors that tend to regulate communities more tightly. So I will say that there is kind of rather than provide an answer, I will say, yes, it seems that in some ways the criminal governance can be a replacement of a state authority, but in other cases, it seems to be the case that is enabled because there is collusion with the state. And that will be in the case of militias, for example. So there is a lot to unpack here. It will also depend how strong criminal governance may depend on what's the nature of civil society in the places where criminal groups operate, right? So we do know from some of the research on criminal governance, but also research on rebel groups, that when civil society is stronger, is more organized, it may be able to resist or at least limit more what criminal groups do. And as Federico was saying, territorial control is key for criminal governance. However, one thing, and I've seen this in Latin America, especially during COVID, and this actually creating some questions for me, which I think in some cases actually criminal groups may try to govern to try and impose territorial control. So in cases where are competing with other groups, for example, in Colombia, it seems to be the case that the groups that were trying more strongly to do what Federico was saying, just providing services or regulate even quarantines, were groups that were trying to impose territorial control in places where they don't have it already, where they are competing with others. So I think there is an interesting question to think about here about what territorial control means. I will say probably territorial presence is necessary, but control, I think that there are some questions there. There are some people who argue that the type of illicit market also matters in terms of explaining where there is criminal governance. I'm not so sure about this one, but I think it's worth considering, in some ways you need to control territory more if you rely on extortion than if you rely on other types of markets, or if you rely more on the international smuggling of drugs. So I know there is a lot here, but I think I'm just throwing things for the reflection as we think about this topic. So I think I'm gonna skip these things about defining criminal governance, because I will say that the key point I want to make is that I do believe that all groups that engage in criminal activities at some level may do some governance, but I do think that I'm not sure that it's actually something that defines criminal groups or organized crime in Latin America. And I do think that there is actually a lot of variation in the way that criminal groups govern. And I think that our challenge is to determine when there is actually governance and where there is not. And again, this is mostly thinking about the Latin American context. This may not be the case in other places. But I do think that there is actually a lot of variation in how criminal groups are present in a territory. And I will illustrate this in the few minutes that I have left. Hopefully, I don't know how successful I'm gonna be. But with two cases that I've been studying for a long time, which are the cities of Cali and Medellin in Colombia. And again, I have a lot here, but these are Medellin and Cali, and some of you may be familiar. These are two cities that have had a long history with organized crime, where basically the birthplace of the main Colombian cartels, Paulo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, and the cartel de Cali in Cali. But then over the years, even after those organizations were dismantled, there have been like a very complex array of organizations and manifestations of criminality and armed groups in Medellin and Cali. So in some ways they are similar, right? Like they have these long histories that start with drug trafficking, but that become much more than that are both attached to the complexity of the armed conflict in Colombia. But when you look at these two cities today, criminal groups behave in radically different ways. They behave very, very differently in terms of how they regulate violence and how able they are to regulate violence. They look very different in terms of how the lower ranks of gangs and criminal groups behave. And they look very different in terms of the type of the scope of social control and the relations with the community that they have. And again, my point here is to highlight that I think that there are different scales and gradations of criminal governance. And I think a lot of the discussion that I'm having with colleagues in Latin America is actually, when do we know that there is actually criminal governance and when we say this is not criminal governance? So let me just illustrate with a couple of things this difference. So if you look, these are the homicide rates in these two cities throughout the 2000s. Medellin is in red and Cali is in blue. So Medellin, and as you may know, it's a city that is seen like kind of a miracle city, right? But the reality is that in Medellin, actually, there is a very strong presence of criminal organizations as homicide rates have declined. Cali has seen transformations, has seen declines in homicides, but it's still one of the most violent cities in Colombia, is still one of the most violent cities in the world. So one of the questions is why, right? Like there are criminal groups operating in both places. Why are criminal groups seem more able to regulate violence in Medellin than they are in Cali? So this is one manifestation of the different behavior of both groups. Also, there is a very clear difference in how the lower ranks of these groups behave. So these are excerpts from interviews that I've done in the two cities. For example, in Cali, when I ask people, how do the criminal groups in the city look like? In general, they seem to be less hierarchical. There are not very clear connections between different ranks of power in criminal groups. And the local level street gangs seem to be very disconnected from the top of criminal organizations, even though they do work for them. So a member of the attorney's office told me actually something like this. He said, yeah, there are criminal structures, but it's difficult to get to the leaders with solid evidence. One has to look for ways to take down those who become visible. The leaders put someone who carries all the criminal goodwill. One knows, for example, that someone is from Los Rastrojos. One hears nicknames of the traditional bosses here, but it's very difficult to identify the bosses. So the structure of the organizations is very different. Whereas in Medellin, the gangs are much more hierarchical. The gangs at the local level are really embedded in the criminal order, and the gangs themselves become regulators. They're much more sophisticated. Also, I'm almost done here. But in Medellin, for example, when asked a similar question, I will get answers like this, is a structure has a mid-level authority. So you say, I work with Caliche. Caliche belongs to the Medellin group. To Piche's command, here, this guy belongs to this one. This is the aunt, this is the mother, higher up is the abuela. These are ways of talking about like the criminal hierarchy. Basically, what this person was telling me and what other people were telling me is that there is this clear ranking, there is this clear organization, but that also means that the lower level gangs regulate their behavior as much as the top of the criminal organization. And the social control is very different. In Medellin, criminal groups engage in all sorts of activities, regulate life, participate in regulating licit and illicit markets, mediate disputes. And this has to do with what I just mentioned before, which is this structure of criminal groups is very different. So in Medellin, for example, somebody told me, if you sit down with one of these boys, one of the members of the gangs, it's not like it was 20 years ago when they had a marijuana cigarette in their hands with a totally different discourse. Now they start talking with a book in their hands, they are reading, they follow the news, they do social work, they are taking over the Juntas de Acción Comunal, which are communal councils, to see how to support the social projects they are carrying out. None of this appears in Cali, or appears in a much more kind of diffuse way. So I think the point, and just to not take so much more time, the point I'm trying to make here is we have two cities with very complex stories of organized crime, but where criminal groups behave in very different ways in terms of governance. And I think this happens across the region. So in some ways, I think a challenge we have is understanding exactly what of these behaviors is criminal governance, when there is criminal governance. Maybe there is criminal governance at some level in all groups, but there is different intensities of criminal governance. Not all groups do all the activities that we're just talking about. Not all groups regulate conflicts, provide social benefits, all of that. And just my last comment, talking about what Federico was saying, one of the surprising things I found is that Medellin, despite being the place where I see these tendencies of criminal governance more embedded and strong, doesn't seem to have been a place where criminal groups have done a whole lot during the pandemic. And that has been, I found that through interviews, and Benjamin Lessing has been doing also surveys there, and he and his group found the same thing, that people don't report as much of criminal groups doing kind of social work during the pandemic, which for me has also kind of like raised a question, because we do see other groups doing this in other regions, right? So again, I think that raises the question of why and under what conditions will some groups decide to do a lot more, or just whatever is necessary for them to survive? And I think that's an interesting question. And I will stop, and sorry for taking a few more minutes.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Arturo, for inviting me to participate in this great workshop with, as Angelica says, lots of people who, you know, I've admired for a long time, and it's great to actually be kind of together at the same time and having this discussion. I'm going to, in some ways, my talk takes off a little bit from where Angelica stopped. And the starting point of the talk is this notion that, you know, on the one hand, we have this kind of visions of gangs, particularly as kind of an embodiment of kind of anarchy and disorder, which is something which is very commonplace. Yet on the other hand, we have a long existing tradition of research which highlights how gangs can be institutional vectors for the imposition and promotion of particular forms of local social structuration, something which we are now increasingly talking about as kind of criminal governance. Now, criminal governance, of course, is a rather oxymoronic term in many ways. And one of the things that the literature on gangs particularly highlights, from the classic work Frederick Thrasher on gangs in 1920 Chicago, through to the work of Svetlana Stevenson, for example, on gangs in late 20th century Russia, or the work of Didier Gondola on gangs in 1950s Congo, to that of Lirio Gutierrez Rivera on early 21st century gangs in Honduras, is that this kind of criminal governance or the social structuration is actually something which can vary very significantly across time and space. And I think these differences are very significant to take into account. Now, I want to kind of try and unpack this idea by kind of drawing on research that I've been conducting in Nicaragua for now almost a quarter of a century, which makes me feel very old when I say that, as well as kind of more recent research, which I've been doing in South Africa, comparative research between Nicaragua and South Africa. Now I'm going to begin by I'll be talking more about the gangs in Nicaragua, partly because the work in South Africa is relatively nascent and so on. But I want to kind of riff off from the Nicaragua work on to South Africa. Now, gangs in Nicaragua emerged in kind of early 90s in the kind of post-conflict context. And they emerged from the wartime experiences of former Sandinista Popular Army conscripts. More specifically, in a broader context marked by chronic violence and insecurity, groups of youth came together as vigilante groups to protect their friends and families. Gang members from this epoch systematically mentioned three basic reasons for joining a gang. Firstly, that the change of regime in Nicaragua from revolutionary to neoliberal democracy in 1990 led to an abrupt devaluation of their social status, which, as conscripts defending the revolution, had previously been very high, and becoming gang members had seemed a means of reaffirming themselves vis-a-vis a wider society which they felt seemed to rapidly forget them. Secondly, becoming gang members had been a way of recapturing some of the dramatic yet marking and almost addictive adrenaline-charged experiences of war, danger, and death, but also of comradeship and solidarity, which they had lived through as conscripts, and which were rapidly becoming scarce commodities in post-conflict Nicaragua. But perhaps most importantly, something that kept on coming up in all the interviews I did with gang members of that generation was that becoming a gang member had seemed to many a natural continuation of their previous role as soldiers. The post-revolutionary period was marked with a highly uncertain time. It was marked by political polarization, violence, and spiraling insecurity. And these youth talked about how they felt they could better serve and protect their friends and families more effectively as members of a gang than as individuals, just as when they had been part of an army, kind of structured and organized, they could protect the nation. So drawing on their military training, as well as the pandilla or gang culture that was historically one of the traditional institutional vehicles for youth organization in poor urban neighborhoods in Nicaragua, they formed gangs in order to better defend their social networks. Now in the mid-1990s, however, or by the mid-1990s rather, the ex-conscript members of those first post-war gang iterations matured out of the gang and were replaced by new members, younger members who had no military background or personal experience of revolution. But the vigilante norms and practices of the previous gang members persisted. Rather than being based on an individual experience of defending the revolution, they became based on a local sense of, or a sense of local territoriality, which can be linked in very broad terms to a shrinking of the collective social imaginary in post-revolutionary Nicaragua, one that Juan Carlos Núñez has described very well as involving an ontological shift from the nation to the neighborhood. Now, this fundamentally affected the nature of gang activities. Gangs' previous vigilante violence had been rather ad hoc in nature and principally aimed against individuals perceived as threatening to gang members' families and friends. Gangs in mid-1990s Nicaragua, however, went much further than this and became veritable institutional mediums for the organization of collective life in the slums and poor neighborhoods of the country's cities. Beyond just protecting friends and families, gang members no longer targeted members of their local community when they engaged in delinquent activities, but rather actively engaged in activities that explicitly aimed to mitigate crime and delinquency for local inhabitants in the neighborhood. They would, for example, regularly patrol the neighborhood's borders. They would also kind of provide free bodyguard services to any inhabitant who needed to run errands outside the neighborhood. Now, even what at first glance seems to be an inherently destructive and anarchic form of gang violence, namely gang warfare, obeyed very strict rules and moreover had significant socially constructive dimensions, to the extent that it can be argued that it was about a broader form of social structuration and not just the form of kind of violence. It was telling that during the mid-1990s, gang members in Barrio Luis Fernando Hernandez, the poor neighborhood in Managua, the capital city of Nicaragua, where I've been carrying out longitudinal ethnographic research since 1996, motivated or justified their violence as being motivated by a love, querer, for the neighborhood. As a gang member called Julio put it during an interview, you show the neighborhood that you love it by putting yourself in danger for people, by protecting them from other gangs. You look after the neighborhood, you help them, you keep them safe by going to war against other gangs. Now, this is by no means as implausible as it may initially seem. Gang wars followed very set patterns. The first battle of a gang war typically involved fighting with fists and stones, and each new battle involved an escalation of weaponry, first to sticks, then to knives and broken bottles, and eventually to mortars, guns, AK-47s, and fragmentation grenades. Although the rate of escalation could vary, the sequence never did, so gangs never began their wars immediately with firearms. There was a very kind of symbolic almost ritualized dimension to kind of gang warfare. And the fixed nature of gang warfare effectively constituted not only a mechanism for restraining violence, because escalation is a process which is always in which each stage calls for a definite but limited intensity of action and is always under active control. But the escalation process also provided local neighborhood inhabitants with an early warning system. So gang wars in many ways constituted a kind of scripted performance that offered a means of circumscribing the all-pervading unpredictability of the insecurity that was the overwhelming feature of the lives of inhabitants in poor urban neighborhoods in Nicaragua in the 1990s. Now, although the gang wars often did have negative consequences for local populations as bystanders were injured and killed in the crossfire, these effects were indirect. The source of the threat stemmed from other gangs, whom the local gang engaged with in a prescribed manner, limiting the scope of violence in its own neighborhood and creating something of a spatial safe haven. In a context of chronic insecurity and violence, this was recognized as something positive, even if it was not always effective, by local neighborhood inhabitants. As one called Don Sergio put it, the gang looks after the neighborhood and screws others. It protects us and allows us to feel a little bit safer, to live our lives a little bit more easily. Gangs are not a good thing, and it's their fault that we have to live with all this insecurity. But that's a general problem about gangs, not of our gang here in the neighborhood. They protect us, they help us. Without them, things would be much worse for us. Local inhabitants frequently talk very approvingly of the local gang and its members. They would also provide active assistance to gang members, for example, hiding them if they were chased by other gang members or private security guards whilst engaged in their delinquent activities. Now, this was not just because gangs were functional purveyors of a sense of predictability and security, but it was also because they provided local inhabitants with a medium for enacting an otherwise absent form of community. There existed a very strong sense of identification with the gang in Barrio Luis Fernando Hernandez, which in many ways constituted the principal anchor point for a notion of collectivity in a wider context of social fragmentation and community discombobulation. In particular, there existed something of a communal aesthetic pleasure linked to the local gang's violent activities, which was actualized through neighborhood inhabitants avidly swapping stories about the local gang, exchanging eyewitness accounts, spreading rumors and retelling various incidents over and over again, thereby effectively converting the gang into a symbolic index of the local collectivity. Now, I think we can definitely think about a gang that acts in this way as a form of governance. But rather than calling it kind of criminal governance, I want to actually put forward the idea that we should be thinking in terms of gang governance, with the focus being on governance, not so much the kind of gang element. One of the problems for me with the label criminal governance is that, first of all, it exceptionalizes a lot of elements of governance, violence, for example. It also focuses very much on certain elements more than others. And this is something that Angelica said, that, and also Federico said, that different criminal groups are not just involved in criminal activity, they are involved in other things and search for other things. So if we kind of go back to a kind of basic notion of governance as relating to the enaction of particular operational rules which shape specific outcomes, or more broadly, the existence of specific rules and practices that regularly shape the actions of social actors. So where there are kind of administrative, spatial, imaginary, and constitutive dimensions, we can start seeing perhaps criminal governance, or what I want to call here gang governance, as something less exceptional and perhaps more normal. And governance is obviously something that we generally associate with states, generally. And the particular modes of action or regimes. You have kind of welfare states, neoliberal states, Republican states. These all provide different kind of forms of governance, different forms of citizenship, but we kind of label them all as governance. And they are kind of forms of deconstructing governance. But we don't seem to do this with criminal governance very much. And there's no reason why we can't just think that an institution other than the state can normatively provide a form of governance. Certainly, It can be argued that the brief overview I gave you of Nicaraguan gang dynamics in the 1990s included spatial, imaginary, and constitutive dimensions. It perhaps didn't really have much in the way of administrative dimensions, but it's not just gangs in 1990s Nicaragua that can be associated with governance process in very kind of clear ways. In other places, this dimension is more obvious. And this is something that really came to the fore during the course of the research that I've been carrying out in South Africa with my colleague Stefan Jensen from the University of Aalborg in Denmark, in the Cape Town township of Capricorn, where we were able to very much observe a very systematic form of gang governance, one which kind of initially surprised us a little bit. The township is dominated by a gang called the Junkie Funky Kids. Now, one of the things about that neighborhood is that it actually has very low levels of violence, particularly compared to the neighboring neighborhood, which is in the midst of a massive civil war between different branches of the Junkie Funky Kids, which has killed over 200 people in a neighborhood of 2,000 people in the course of a year, which by any measure is a huge number of people to die violently. Now, our first inkling of the kind of different form of local gang governance going on in Capricorn came during the course of an interview with Jane and Henry, two Congolese migrants who had a second-hand furniture shop, which was in one of these modified shipping containers. During the course of the interview, they explained to us how, as a local business, they paid the Junkie Funky Kids 500 Rand, or 35 euros, tax every month as an insurance. Both Stefan and I were very skeptical of this kind of framing. You know, this seemed to us, oh, this is extortion, clearly. I mean, what kind of protection are they kind of really providing? But Jane and Henry were very adamant. No, they're really providing a service to us here. We were forced to admit when there was something to it. When we'd arrived and we observed Jane taking 10 minutes to unlock the shop. As you can see, you can't see them all, but there were 14 different locks on the shop door. And then we sat down and did our interview. And at the end of the interview, we suggested that we might take them out for lunch. And they said, okay, sure, let's go. And they just walked out of the shop, leaving everything open. I kind of immediately said, wait a minute, don't you need to lock up? Said, oh, no, the guy's come now. What do you mean the guy? And she pointed to somebody who was kind of sitting in the street a little bit further down and said, you know, he's a Junkie Funky Kid. He'll make sure nobody comes in. So literally, he hadn't been there in the morning because you have to pay a premium to get night service. But they literally walked out of their shop, leaving it completely open for lunch with us. They subsequently told us that, you know, the gang actually had taken over a building in the middle of the township, which everybody locally called the office. And it's where you went if you had any problems, if you had been mugged or if you had been robbed, that you go and describe the person who had mugged you or robbed you and what had been robbed. And the gang would normally go off and violently get it back for you. They also commented, rather surprisingly, that the gang was in the process of conducting a formal census survey of the township because they wanted to kind of institute a kind of generalized protection program beyond businesses in which they announced they would be levying a monthly fee of 30 Rand, so 2 euros per household, in exchange for which households would be guaranteed protection. Now, the US political scientist Desmond Arias has described quite similar situations in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in the late 90s and 2000s, where drug gangs resolved disputes, maintained rough justice, and provided protection to businesses in the city's favelas. He also shows, however, that this order was very biased towards a particular group and was less tolerant of marginality and difference. So he highlights how gang governance can be very instrumental in nature and speculates that it can actually consequently change very rapidly as a result. Now, this, I think, is something very important and under-considered when we think about kind of notions such as criminal governance and so on. It's actually that it is something quite volatile. This is important because considering how gang governance in Nicaragua changed radically from the 1990s to the 2000s was the rise of drug trafficking, which led to a more predatory form of gang governance. Certainly, when I returned to Barrio Luis Fernando Hernandez in the early 2000s, in stark contrast to the 90s, the local gang was now the vector for a localized regime of terror that was based on fear, threats, and widespread acts of arbitrary violence against local inhabitants. as a local inhabitant called Doña Yolanda told me. Before, you could trust the gang, but not anymore. They threaten, they attack people from the barrio now. They rob them of whatever they have, whoever they are. They never did that before. They used to protect us, look out for us. But now they don't care. They only look out for themselves. People are scared. You've got to be careful what you say or what you do, because otherwise they'll attack you. Even if you say nothing, they might still come and rob you. Come into your home, steal a chair, food, some clothes, whatever they find. It's their way of telling you to be careful. We live in terror here in the barrio. You have to be scared, or else you'll be sure to be sorry. So rather than protecting local neighborhood inhabitants, the gang now terrorized them through arbitrary violence and the threat of violence. Yet, as different as the gang was in the early 2000s compared to the 1990s, it was still very much about governance, the promulgation of a sense of structuration. And the basis through which it governed was different. It stemmed from gang members' ability to carry out arbitrary acts of violence that displayed very little regularity, rather than imposing predictable behavioral and cosmological frameworks. But both instances can be seen perhaps as different iterations of a single governance process. I mean, I'm suggesting we could perhaps distinguish between type 1 and type 2 forms, with the former, and here I'm drawing on Michel Foucault's distinction between different forms of governmentality being based on letting others die, so you just protect your heartland and don't care about the rest, and type 2, corresponding to the kind of drug gangs, being about making people live in a particular way. They're two different forms of governance, but they both constitute governance. Now, this is what I think is important to think about here. This transformation of Nicaraguan gang governance raises issues regarding the long-term viability of gang governance, and more broadly, what is the ideal institutional vehicle for governance? If gangs are kind of very much a volatile social institutions, why would that be, say, compared to states? Perhaps it could be related to the nature and the scale of gang governance compared to state governance. Partly because gang governance emerges as a local phenomena, it could be argued that it does not intrinsically imply the development of an encompassing interest in the same way that the governance of a state does, at least conceptually. Yet at the same time, state governance is itself by no means stable. In particular, the evolution of the nature of the Nicaraguan state's governance regime has in many ways evolved in a way that very much mirrors the type 1 to type 2 gang governance transformation of gangs. During the 1980s, the revolutionary Sandinista state had a very deep regulatory presence in urban neighborhoods, including poor slums, where populations are organized into local defense, Sandinista defense committees that manage everyday life, something very similar to what the gang did, you could argue. Following a temporary absence during most of the 1990s, a newly reconstituted and avowedly neoliberal and neo-oligarchic state developed new violent regulatory practices in the 2010s, which included shock and awe police patrolling linked to the containment of violence in the periphery and the protection of the elite core. Police only came into the slum armed to the teeth, often participating shootouts on an unpredictable and arbitrary basis, while increasing its presence in richer neighborhoods, as well as the newly emerging malls that became central economic and social focal points for the Nicaraguan upper class. It's something which was also very similar in South Africa. Since the early 2000s, the South African state has waged a formally declared war on gangs, operating through counterinsurgency tactics which are reminiscent of apartheid repression, aimed both at protecting the white heartland and spatially containing violence in townships through the creation of a climate of fear. So in other words, both in Nicaragua and South Africa, state governance has become very mimetic of type 2 gang governance, based on the protection of a heartland for the benefit of a small minority through arbitrary shock and awe violence. Now, this is something that arguably came to a head in Nicaragua in April 2018, when the country was the theater of a mass popular uprising against the current government. Now representing an elite oligarchy rather than the poor majority of the population, the regime has become increasingly unpopular. The government's attempt to implement huge pension cuts and tax increases in a broader context of increasing levels of impoverishment and inequality were the spark that led to mass demonstrations across the country. The government violently repressed the protests and instituted a reign of terror through arbitrary acts of violence and imposing curfews. Over 600 people were killed, Hundreds more disappeared, thousands arrested, and over 80,000 Nicaraguans fled across the border to Costa Rica. The pacification process that subsequently took place over a number of months, and is still in some ways ongoing, involved the police on the one hand, but also what people are calling in Nicaragua parapoliciales, parapolice. So armed groups of civilians deputized by the police, in other words. And many of those recruited into the parapoliciales were gang members. Now, the recruitment of gang members by the government to disrupt opposition is not new, and it responds to a clear logic of recruiting violent experts. But it has occurred on a much larger scale than previously, with the number of parapoliciales in Nicaragua estimated to be around 10,000 in total, almost as big as many as the police. And not all are former gang members. You have military veterans, former policemen, and Sandinista party activists as well. But gangs are widely thought to make up a significant proportion. But more broadly, what this kind of very much development signals in some ways is you could argue, a nationalization of gang governance, a kind of raising it from the local to the national level, which is one more reason for kind of perhaps trying to kind of take the focus away from kind of the criminal governance element, but think about governance generally and think about how different types of governance can be implemented by different types of institutions, and that a criminal organization like a gang or a mafia or a drug cartel doesn't necessarily have to put in place a kind of form of governance that is to be considered in the same way as a state form of governance. It can also kind of put it will put in place a form of governance which is its own, and perhaps we need to label it its own rather than kind of just giving it kind of these generic labels which are kind of quite negative and stereotyping. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Arthur. I am very glad to stay here with you. All of you I had the pleasure to meet before, and all of you I've known through your works. For me, it's a very honor to be here with you today. Well, I will talk about a prison governance in Brazil that became a criminal governance when it is spilled out of prison and overreaching the urban territories in Brazil. In the last 3 decades, the increase in the prison population led to emergence of group of prisoners whose objective was to denounce the bad conditions in Brazilian prisons. Some of this group quickly expanded into prison system, and less than a decade, their influence is spilled out of prison and take place in many illicit markets and criminal activities around the city. The main of this group bases, the main of this prison-based group is the first capital command, in Portuguese, Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC, originated in São Paulo, a state that holds 30% of the Brazilian prisoners. PCC is a kind of an example for other smaller groups that had emerged across the country. This group have exercised some kind of governance and prison, building a prison order in which violent conflicts have been reduced in some places. In other places, there is no some reduced as well. They exercise control over prison dynamics in a context of low state prison management capacity. At the same time, this prison governance overflows from prison to poor neighborhoods in many cities, articulating a governance and in and out of prison, connect these two social worlds through a criminal governance. The criminal governance established by the PCC in São Paulo can be considered a more advanced form of governance of the prison and from the prisons. That is a model that was replicated by the PCC itself in other contexts, in other places, and by other groups in all other Brazilian states with greater or lesser adjustment to the São Paulo model. It means that are different from the groups as same as the CV, the Comando Vermelho, and other one in relation to the PCC. Then I will talk about, first of all, about the São Paulo model of prison governance, how it emerged and changed prison relationships. The PCC was created in 1993 in a prison in São Paulo. They also call themselves the party of the crime or family. And their motto is peace, justice, freedom, and equality. Basically, they defend the idea that the prison population must unite themselves around the fight against oppression and against the oppressor, that is the state, the enemy of all prisoners. Membership is delimited by baptism, through which the individual becomes part of the group and is called brother, acquires a series of responsibilities and assumes a commitment with the crime. That is very important to understand the PCC dynamics and govern. Through the 90s, the PCC expanded to São Paulo prisons, causing a lot of violence against prisoners who did not accept its governance proposal, promote violent riots and spectacular escapes, gain visibility inside and outside prisons. To summarize this process, it can be said that in 2006, the power of the PCC was already consolidated in the prisons of the state of São Paulo, which were profoundly changed the form of governance and construction of order in prisons. Some conditions to the emergency expansions of the PCC are clearly here. Mass incarceration, overcrowding of prisons, and poor living conditions. State violence symbolized by the Carandiru massacre in 1992, 1 year before the born of the PCC, the incapacity of the state to exercise the governance of prisons. In this sense, a situation of high levels of violence, insecurity, and fear created by the conditions for the emergence of a group that from the beginning proposed to impose social order, create a standard of conduct for life in prisons, and disseminate a framework of ideas alongside a call for engagement in collective action to overcome isolation and individualisms that were spread feeling about between prison population. All conflicts in prisons that were previously resolved individually and generate a lot of violence came to be resolved solely through the regulation of the PCC through its member, who became the only one with the prerogative to mediate and define the solutions for conflicts, including possible punishment. Then the monopolization of opportunities to govern prisons can be identified as the central piece to consolidation of PCC in and outside prisons. Two main kinds of opportunities. First, the economic ones related to informal and illegal trading opportunities, especially but not restricted to the illicit drugs. And second, the political opportunity in respect to the prerogative that the PCC has established a system of control over population in prisons and after in the poor neighborhoods that demands obedience to rules, norms, and forms of conduct established by the organization, and then that allow them regulate and mediate conflicts. In other words, to govern. PCC was able to construct and disseminate the idea of a common destiny to all prisoners, sharing an incarceration experience and soul of suffering and pain. And then the idea that they should not to fight against each other, but to join to fight against state, This is the central idea that was in the origin of the PCC, and it is still is very important still today in their action. The high decrease of physical violence, especially rape and homicide, was the most important effect of this kind of prison governance. As the mass incarceration reached a large number of poor people that live in poor neighborhoods, causing a large turnover of people entering and leaving the prisons, this phenomenon has created a link between these two territories. The social ties between the prison and the poor neighborhood was strengthened, and through these processes, in the first half in the 2000s, we can already observe the overflow of the government established by the PCC in prisons, reaching the poor neighborhoods of São Paulo. Many who served their sentences or escaped from prisons were already baptized in the PCC, and when they returned to the community, they came back or started to work in drug trafficking or in robberies, but they already took the PCC discursive grammar in prisons and its way of operating and organizing business and regulate conflicts to this part of the city. The conditions were in place for the articulation of prison dynamics to criminal dynamics outside the prisons that will mark the scenario of Brazilian public security in the last decade. To understand the spread of the prison governance to poor territory, it is necessary to consider the historical incapacity of the Brazilian state to acquire a monopoly of legitimate physical violence. This inability is linked to the very unequal distribution of economic, social, political resources that result in different access to justice and rights. A society where the basic rights of a large part of population are systematically and daily violated by state agents, especially the military police, where corruption is disseminated, where there is widespread impunity regarding white-collar crime, and where poor young men are killed by death squad in large proportion, and where the mass incarcerated is made up of poor Black young men, alongside a unequal social structure, these elements constitute the conditions within which a criminal organization such as the PCC could emerge and spread. After consolidation its control over prisons and building a prison governance in São Paulo, the PCC spilled over to poor urban areas, driven by the dynamic of incarceration. With this process, he transferred the social regulation that allows the governance of prison to this area, and in this way, started to exercise the governance of poor neighborhoods, especially through the regulation of conflicts related to illicit markets. This leading role in the governance of prisons in poor neighborhoods led the PCC to produce a criminal governance of illicit markets and expand its role in criminal dynamics, especially in networks related to marijuana and cocaine trafficking. It surpassed the São Paulo scene, established itself as a relevant actor in Latin America. The hegemony in São Paulo with control over some territories, especially on the route that runs from Paraguay border to the port of Santos, placed the PCC as an actor in the global networks of the cocaine trade. The PCC take part in the network that involve powerful and diverse groups and actors, such as the Italian mafias and the Mexican cartels. It is not a central position occupied by PCC, but it's set up as a player in this networking, especially due to its regional importance and in strategic areas such as the Brazil-Paraguay border and the highways of the state and Mato Grosso do Sul, São Paulo, and finally in Santos, in the port. Because of this, the PCC is positioned as a necessary partner for the flow of trade between groups that act globally. Because of all this, despite the fact the PCC was born as a prison gang, today it's more than it's more than a prison gang. It's very different from other Brazilian prison groups, but there is no consensus in Brazil about what PCC really is, how to define and how to classify. Finally, I would like to point out some limits or challenges that are presented to replicate this model in São Paulo to other contexts. The prison and criminal governance model created by PCC in São Paulo depends on a series of elements to maintain itself. The hegemony of a single group that succeeds to obtain certain legitimacy vis-à-vis the population under its control, and to manage a web of accommodation with the state is fundamental. And this condition not exist in other areas of Brazil outside of São Paulo. Since 2010, the PCC began to expand to other Brazilian territories and is present in all states in several countries of South America. However, it's very difficult to replicate the governance model in São Paulo, despite the fact the PCC tried to do so, but apparently not with successful until now. The existence of rival groups, the absence of a community and social embeddedness, cultural, geographical, and historical elements which confer particularities to each space and territory led to other forms of governance be constituted. In general, these forms of governance do not have the same stability as the São Paulo model. Conflicts, tensions, and violence emerge as important elements in many cases. To finally, I would like to stress the singularities of the prison criminal governance model in São Paulo that is built on a self-reproducing dynamic. The maintenance of mass incarceration guarantees labor for the PCC, and prison are consolidated as a space for recruiting and building criminal networks. A prison governance carried out by the PCC allows the state to maintain with a much lower cost the incarceration police. On the other hand, the PCC hegemony in São Paulo illicit markets, as well as capacity for social regulations, allows for the reduction of physical violence, especially homicides, which generate political capital for the state authorities that govern the state. The control of prisons by the PCC prevents or reduces the possibility of betrayal of the actors who participate in illicit networks outside prisons. Prison as based to create ties means ties more stable and with the system that fortify itself. For example, family ties can break if an important member die or go to prisons. But when we are talking about prison as ties based, they are fortified just as a result of mass incarceration politics. In other words, the main state police to fight against crime created the conditions for this dynamic to have been built and maintain the conditions to reinforce it. In last years, PCC has expanded its presence in other places, inclusive Latin America and Europe, some countries of Latin America and Europe. And in Brazil, has expanded the criminal activities in which is involved in beyond the classical activities as bank robbery and drug trafficking. It's been reported its participation in illegal mining in indigenous areas and illegal building and environment conservation areas, even Bitcoin mining. That it may be signalized to a criminal diversification related to the PCC. Because of this, many people in Brazil, especially prosecutors and police, has been said, PCCs became a mafioso group. I could confess, I don't know what exactly it means, but I think it's a very point to discuss. I thank all of you again. I hope we can discuss some points of this presentation in dialogue with the presentation that was made before. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be part of this meeting, and thank you particularly for Arturo for organizing this. I want to take you east and take you to India and Indonesia. And I want to I'm going to use the invitation by Arturo to pick up a puzzle that I have been thinking about since I moved my research from India to Indonesia. It should say India and Indonesia here. Because in both countries, I studied a type of criminal individual, which I call a public criminal, which in Indonesia is called preman. They are public criminals in the sense that prioritized here or discussed here in the seminar, which is that they play an important role in governance of their neighborhoods in the ways discussed earlier before, settling disputes, solving petty crime, maintaining order, security, as well as sometimes providing access to state services and institutions. And they get this role both in India and Indonesia because of a certain image of being prone to violence and being threatening in this way, a very public image, which is also why, although it's, well, perhaps not the best word, but why I'm using here now the term public criminal, that their prominence and as well as their livelihood really depends on this being publicly known as a dangerous person. And there's a category for those kind of, a name for those kind of individuals. It's preman in Indonesia, and in India, we would talk about gundas. This is an individual I'm particularly fond of, Mohan Bai, who became a bit of a friend during my fieldwork there, who was a kind of a retired criminal, which is kind of the best category to interview because they talk more. But also because they can look back. And here he showed me his picture book, how he would be here meeting with the chief minister of Gujarat. And here in the middle, you see him with the chief minister of Gujarat and the still current, or at least until recently, the member of state parliament, who he kept in close touch with over the years. Even though, as you see, the embrace seemed to have become a bit more uncomfortable over the years. And it's that embrace that I want to focus my talk on, because this relationship between politicians and criminals, or public criminals, I should say, it has similarities between gundas and premans, but it has a number of important differences too. And I want to reflect on why this difference is, and develop an explanation which I'm going to relate to the electoral system and how electoral system creates different relationships between criminals and politicians. Although two disclaimers apply. One is I will be really writing roughshod over variation within these countries. And second, it is a bit of a tentative argument that I am developing as well. You see, I feel I've fully cracked the puzzle yet, so I hope this seminar will help me. First, we're going to the similarities. As I mentioned, their image really is very important in their functioning. It gives them this governance role, but it also generates a livelihood in the form of protection rackets, somewhere discussed before, and this is really important for both preman and gundas. And it's, as was I think discussed by Angelica, very territory-based as well. They have certain areas under their control, and within these areas, they can collect fees for keeping the area safe. Although it's not as organized service as Dennis mentioned, it's really extortion to a certain extent. Now, these public criminals do also use their image to be able to engage in illegal activities, some mentioned here. Although what I find interesting if we compare with South America is, of course, that it's not that violent and it's not that criminal either. So we're not talking about the kind of complex drug smuggling or violent gang wars. Partly, I think, because these kind of public criminals, their functioning and their status and their livelihood really depends on maintaining good relationships with political actors. And while their capacity for violence is important, they should not overdo their criminal activity, because then they become a nuisance to their political patrons. So they are modest criminals in that sense. They are political creations, first in the sense that there's also a history to them, in the way that colonial regimes relied on these individuals to kind of outsource the maintenance of order in a cheap way. And I think there's a comparison with the emergence of the mafia there, although in a particular colonial kind of dynamic here. So both Preman and Gundas are old creations, but that reliance of authorities on Gundas and Preman to maintain orders within neighborhoods continues to this day. But that's not the only way where they're useful. Both Gundas and Preman are supposed or expected to have a capacity to sway votes and to have influence in their areas to different extent, as you will see. But that provides an important incentive for politicians to maintain close relationships with them, as they are seen as useful for winning votes. Second reason for that is simply money. Both Gundas and Preman are considered to have money power from their illegal activities, and these contributions are often essential to win elections. This is where both Indonesia and India do not differ much, as both countries are these are very expensive elections. Now, I want to use my scarce time to show you a very short clip of a wonderful documentary called The Act of Killing, which is about the anti-communist genocide in '65 in Indonesia, so a different topic, but it has a short part on the functioning of, you will see here, a group of Preman doing classic protection racket work. And it then jumps into the links with politics. And as it illustrates many things I will be talking about, I'm going to use this time. I hope it works. It's just 2.5 minutes. I'll just let it roll because you have the subtitles. So, oh, sorry for the sound, but I hope you got the point. And could follow the subtitles. So there's a lot of I like this clip because there's a lot in there. You could see the uncomfortable face of the shopkeepers taking money. There's an important detail here that these are Chinese shopkeepers, which are very precarious position in Indonesia's political constellation. But there's also that part where the vice president of Indonesia is really courting with charming jokes this vigilante group called Pemuda Pancasila. And here we get into the first important difference between Indonesia and India. And that is that these preman, these public criminals, are often organized through associations, through what is in Indonesia called ormas, organisasi masyarakat, which makes them less territorial than some of these gundas are. These are organizations that are usually regional, but definitely transcend the neighborhood. And also interesting is here the fact in that clip that you saw Yusuf Kala really courting the support of Pemuda Pancasila. It is so often in elections, these groups, these vigilante groups would be supporting candidates. An individual preman would do the same. But that support and their choice for support is not a given. They don't have fixed political patterns, and it's usually kind of a negotiation that repeats itself in the electoral cycle. So here we see an interesting difference. Here, by the way, some pictures of what these ormas look like. And there's a wide variety to be found across Indonesia, and they're all engaged in what we have been calling here this criminal governance, their capacity for violence combined with their political connections really enable them to play an important role in maintaining order and solving problems within neighborhoods, particularly poorer ones. So now moving to India, here a first striking difference is the fact that gundas often become politicians, and this has been quite a hot topic in public debate in Indonesia. That and you see some of the statistics here that in the recent 2019 election, 40% of BJP, being the main party, BJP's parliamentary candidates, had criminal cases against them. And there's a nice book I recommend by Milan Vaishnav who explores this, how that is possible and why that happens. And he relates it to, on the one hand, their money power, the money that they have to pay for expensive elections, but also, and this is important for our comparison, the fact that these public criminals are capable of developing a following of their own, a large group of grateful followers, because of their governance role and their capacity to use their political connections to extract state resources from the state. So patronage that they are able to channel downwards, which makes them political actors in their own right. And so you can see often many individuals starting out as gundas, as my Mohan Bai in the beginning did, but then making a transition to politics, the successful ones. Obviously, Mohan Bai never managed. These are, in very short, two key differences here, that the preman in Indonesia are often more organized jointly in these kind of vigilante groups. And secondly, that we see gundas not only becoming politicians, but also, even if they do not, maintaining close relationship with a political party over a longer period of time. It's not that they never shift, but they're quite close. Here, just some news clips from last month. The one below is from just a few weeks ago, where this state parliamentarian Antasari was finally caught, who is a Gunda that transitioned into politics and had a long-term relationship with BSP. And Vikas Dubey, who has been quite notorious for shooting 8 policemen, had over many years had a close relationship with SP party, and before that with BJP. So just if you would trace the biographies of these Gunas, they thrive on their close links with politicians. So how to explain these differences? And here I try to develop my answers and see how convincing they are in the 5 minutes I have left. I want to emphasize 2 dimensions that are important here, I think. One is the pattern of discretionary control over the state, and then obviously, particularly the police. We are inclined, or in many cases, we might see this control over the state in the hands of political parties. But as I detail in this book, Democracy for Sale, in Indonesia, due to its authoritarian history, actually a lot of control over state resources still lies in the hands of bureaucrats and state actors, who for that reason become political actors by themselves, but also for that reason, political parties are not that influential and useful for individuals, preman, as they need to cultivate a much wider range of connections. But it's also the reason why these preman cannot develop the kind of public standing and access to patronize as their Indian counterparts, and they are not becoming individually important political actors usually. And here I discussed that a bit more in detail, and linking that, I think, to the one incentive that generates for the preman in Indonesia to organize themselves in vigilante groups, that it gives them more bargaining power vis-a-vis both the police, state authorities, and politicians, as individually they don't have enough hold, as they would say, or enough control in their neighborhoods. It's their group, their corporation that gives them that, while we see these gundas becoming politically prominent independently in India. So that's one where one explanation for these differences between India and Indonesia lie. A second one would be, I would propose the electoral system. Indonesia has a proportional representative system where people would, there's parliament made up of different parties allocated based on proportion of votes, while you do have direct elections for government heads, by the way. While in India, you have a first past the post system, which, as Duverger's laws would predict, leads to a lower number of effective parties, and power is shared between a smaller group of parties, which in Indonesia is creating such a fragmented political landscape, with power being shared not just between different parties, but also shared by governors and district heads who are not always loyal or closely linked to political parties, that preman in Indonesia do well to cultivate a wide range of connections and cannot tie themselves as closely to individual political patrons as my friend Mohan Bai did, for example, or as these others example that I mentioned. So political fragmentation, I think Angelica was talking about that too. It also complicates the relationship between politics and public criminals, in the sense that they are then forced or incentivized to tie themselves not too closely to particular politicians, because this would complicate their position and their livelihoods if that particular patron loses. So this is by way of summary, that I think both countries have an important similarity, that they have this category of public criminals, of individuals that use their image their violent image as a way to exercise social control and solve problems within their neighborhoods. And also that in both countries, there's this clear and regular exchange of favors between politicians and these public criminals. But that their relationship with politics differs in terms of the closeness of their relationships with parties and politicians and their associational activity. And I've proposed here that we look at these first two dimensions here, the patterns of discretionary control over the state and the police, and how electoral system generates political fragmentation and competition. A third comparative element that I would like to throw in here is cost of election campaigns, which is very important in that relationship, but it's just similar in both countries. And here I would just end with a few testable explanations that because of that fragmentation in Indonesia, the election results are not that threatening for criminal actors in Indonesia because they have the connections everywhere. In India, I would argue you see turf wars at certain areas when you have one party losing elections and another taking over, because that translates downwards into which Gunda element has lost its political patron and which one has gained new prominence and power and is more likely to get support of the police. So that would be a testable explanation. So that is something I would like to throw in for discussion. Okay, thank you. I'll leave it at this for now.
Thank you very much. And as several people today, I very much liked and appreciated the topic, and I tried to reflect on the elements I've been actually thinking about for a very long time and hadn't had the chance before to actually expand on much further. And my actual topic today is the criminal, what I call the criminal violence governance, what I call the emergence and roots of the rise of criminal governance in Africa. And I tried here, sorry, can you all see my screen still? I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my computer.
Yes, why don't you just put it in the mode of, presentation mode?
Yeah, just a second. All right. Bit of an issue here. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Perfect.
Yeah, but unfortunately that won't work. I'm sorry. That won't work. I'm gonna stay like this if it's okay. Because yeah, it'd just be easier.
Yes.
All right. So what is very interesting about this is that I think that if we actually come back to the roots of criminal governance in Africa, we must have, and it is actually detrimental that we must have a critical look at the action of the international community in the emergence of criminal governance in this region. And that's pretty much what I'm going to try to do today. I would like first to remember all that when we mention organized crime and corruption as an ancient biologic phenomenon, an incurable disease, it has become in some way a shorthand, in my view, in international policy circles, in the sense that those phenomenon are irremediably correlated to the mere existence of human society and its natural development. And indeed, it serves as a diagnosis that it is used to explain rackets that exercise control over certain states' bodies, politicians, judges, police forces, or territory. The symptoms of, the actual symptoms of criminal presence in a territory are allegedly known to all. The effects that are manifested in numerous affected states, we mentioned a few in previous presentations, include direct or indirect violence, a coercive and predatory public administration, judicial impunity, economic distortions, and even a broad cultural tolerance of the coveted criminal lifestyles, both in rural and urban areas. However, as I think even Briscoe points out, if illicit activities are and associated actors have become an integral part of socioeconomic systems, of cultural norms productions, of local and national governance, their presence and influence vary naturally considerably across countries. And most African states are widely perceived as being ridden with numerous fragilities and organized crime becoming a systemic part of governance. It is a constant resource for politicians and officials, which in certain circumstances can trigger massive public discontent and even political instability. And as illicit activity has become progressively more embedded in societies and criminals, powerful actors in states. However, the ways in which criminals actors have captured parts of the states, notably cities or rural areas, remain an untold story. Transnational criminal organizations are rich and powerful, highly structured, long-lasting, flexible, and multifaceted bodies. The rise of African organized crime, I think most of you and everyone would know Nigerian crime syndicate, but there are many others, Guinean, Malian, South African, Somali gangs. And one of their key strengths is their adaptable morphology and their capacity to merge with their environment, to adjust to its evolution and exploit its regulatory, socioeconomic, anthropologic, and political strengths and weaknesses. Hence, as in Europe, Asia, or America, organized crime and criminal activities in Africa have emerged in all kinds of political regimes and socioeconomic environments. Nonetheless, it is worth mentioning that transnational drug trafficking operations, especially cocaine and heroin, counterfeit medicine and cigarettes, as well as environmental crimes, have all thrived in Africa since the early 90s. Coincidentally, since the 80s, most African countries have fallen under the scope of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank's structural adjustment programs. And what we are basically going to try to do in this presentation today is to see if the correlation actually can be made between both trends, both phenomena. So has pretty much the establishment of neoliberal regulatory, political, and socioeconomic framework in African countries enforced by the IMF and the World Bank fostered the rise of systemic violence and organized crime? Has it changed to its roots, the governance system? I'm not going to come back too long. You all know it, on the Bretton Woods agreement and the Bretton Woods institutions. What we all need to remember very shortly is that this system collapsed in 1973 following Richard Nixon's decision to uncouple the value of the dollar to US gold reserves in August 1971. And this was naturally a decisive period in the sense that the IMF hoped that floating rates would solve balance of payment disequilibrium across the globe, almost automatically pretty much, and it would naturally encourage states to focus on their most comparatively advantageous export products and limit overpriced imports due to increasing competition. And partly due to a series of commodities and debt crises in the early 80s, this scenario did not happen. On the contrary, it provoked a massive debt crisis in the least developed countries, such as in Mexico in 1982. What naturally it triggered, that in reaction, the IMF and the World Bank upscaled their presence in low and middle income countries through the launch of several loans and development programs. The IMF notably replaced standby agreements with long-term loans up to 10 years, tranche-based extended fund facility, and enhanced structural adjustment facility. Sorry to come back to these technicalities, but this is quite important. Heavy conditionality accompanied these loans and projects, which were both financed by the IBRD and the IMF through the High Impoverished Poor Countries Initiative, which was recently rebranded the Poverty Reduction and Growth Funds. This strong shift in the policy prescriptions of the IMF and the World Bank was known as the Washington Consensus and was inspired by neoliberal economists such as John Williamson, advising Western leaders ruling both institutions at the time. what is here again fascinating is that the rational or ideological assumption behind this policy choice is that enhancing countries' economic development is dependent on the stabilization of their internal commercial balance through tight monetary and fiscal policies. To grant their loans, the IMF and the World Bank impose a strong budgetary discipline, a reduction of public deficit through the rationalization of government spending. Changing slide, sorry. So the rationalization of government spending in key infrastructure, primary health, and education projects. This stable internal economic situation supposedly creates incentives for foreign actors to invest in the country, notably by moderating interests and inflation rates. In addition, the IMF and the World Bank strongly encourage local government to create a fiscal and monetary attractive environment for private and public foreign investors. And among their demands are tax reforms, including the reduction of corporate tax, the removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade in order to enhance market liberalization, as well as the privatization of state-owned enterprise, the sale of public assets on stock markets to private investors. Finally, the IMF and the World Bank encourage deregulation and the lowering of legal barriers, which were impeding market entries, restricting competition and trade liberalization. And while those were supposed to be self-guarded, legal guarantees on property rights, on environmental protection and consumer protection have all been seriously affected and impacted by those policies. Hence, these 8 programs, I put this in brackets, have been the subject of much criticism, not least because they have a 75% failure rate, according to a law estimate. And furthermore, the dramatic economic, political, and social consequences of these programs have often been understated. In the 80s, Ghana, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia were promising developing countries. The fall in agricultural prices, kleptocratic management, and neo-colonial interferences led this country to serious economic crisis. But ACP's climate, we could also here mention climate change, but structural adjustment programs had serious impact. Again, against against the loan, the IMF and the World Bank offered loan again with exorbitant interest rates in exchange for structural adjustment. So in addition to market liberalization and the reorientation of local industrial and agrarian products towards the most rational choices, the IMF and the World Bank imposed what we call the cost recovery, which in practice means the privatization of public services to enable states to reallocate their investments. In concrete terms, this means that schools, hospitals, basic food and water become chargeable. In these countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, this privatization of public services has produced misery, inequality, and many injustices. In fact, it has considerably reduced the quality of schools, of hospitals, of public transportations, etc., especially in rural areas. People basically had to choose between potable water and school. In addition, a lot of countries, and this also applied in Asia and South America, by the way, had been encouraged to turn towards markets and free trades and to direct all agricultural domestic production towards the most favorable goods in terms of comparative advantage. So these countries have therefore been forced to abandon their subsistence crops, plantain, groundnuts, etc., which have further destroyed and agricultural production have been further destroyed by mining and negative externalities due to illegal expropriation of properties and lands and environmental damage, notably land sterilization. So favorable fiscal and environmental deregulation have allowed foreign companies to extract national resources and wealth without contributing at all to local economies. So basically, the policy of structural adjustment, to conclude here on the first part of my presentation, the policy of structural adjustment has led to massive unemployment and famines in rural areas, and thus to a massive exodus to the cities, where the problems have accumulated. It increased inequality as the state was unable to provide the population with very basic public services on an equal footing in overpopulated capital suburbs. The scarcity of available resources and positions of power this is critical here. The scarcity of available resources and positions of power encourage corruption and kleptocracy. And those phenomena were often associated with ethnic, geographical, and religious cleavages and discrimination. Basically, as the state became the sole guarantor of all forms of security and was reduced to a role of being the sole provider of public contracts and the arbitrator of public contracts for private companies. Accessing to state power meant being able to secure education, health, and physical protection to a clan, an ethnic, a group of people, and accessing the money pot. This in turn created naturally a lot of resentments and the roots of political violence. It also increased dependence on alternative providers of education, health. We can mention here Islamic and evangelical humanitarian aid, but it also created a breeding ground for criminal actors to take root in these societies. And as someone that Arturo knows well now, Clotilde Champéras mentioned and has shown in her work, criminal organization developed the capacity to establish a system of waiting lines and monitored access to goods, also named artificial scarcities. And we have seen that throughout Africa. We see that in Lagos, we see that in Abidjan, we see that in Mombasa, we see that in Johannesburg. Transnational organizations use their corruptive and coercive powers and the implementation and the territorial implementation to control the access to vital goods or services, to water, to housing, to social order, to votes also naturally. This strategy guarantees them a durable social legitimacy and a political leverage. It anchors a new social order in a territory that is open to criminal organizations with specific rules of exclusion and inclusion. And it naturally generates substantive gains for the criminal organizations as the controlled goods and services sees their value constantly increase. This biased competition and social imbalances on access to physical and intangible resources can be directly traced back again to the deregulation and destruction of public services encouraged by the IMF and World Bank duo. The faint or neglected neutrality of the state is not in line with the laissez-faire theory of letting natural market forces settle conflict of interest and wills for the better. On the contrary, this neutrality of the state contributes to perpetuating or even establishing a pattern of privileges in favor of criminals. Criminal organizations have sufficient room for maneuver to manipulate the content of environmental and legal rights and to impose their will on other members of society without appearing to be breaking the law. This is, for instance, the case for counterfeit medicine, tramadol trafficking, diazepam trafficking throughout Africa, where through their implementation within the public health ministries, they have actually managed to get official authorization for such trafficking operation, and they have literally spread a counterfeit medicine throughout the African continent. What we can see here basically is that organized crime and criminalized governments have pretty much sterilized entrepreneurs' potential and forced a migration of talents throughout Africa. We can mention here notably Nigeria, where this phenomenon is particularly strong. I would like here very quickly to mention I would like to solicit here the concept of criminal insurrection that John P. Sullivan and Johan Grillo have developed, and I'm very much like part of what they have written. I think that the thriving territorial and political power of organized crime in Mexico, in Africa, in Karachi, in Manila, throughout the world, have actually led to the creation of what we can call criminal enclaves, territory where there is basically a sovereignty of transnational criminal organizations that is uncontested. And this, as many have already shown in today's presentation, have been the ground basis of their power. And we must also refrain of calling these places, these territories, as being non-governed, or as they are very much governed by criminal institutions. They are just immune to the rule of law and to government's legitimate power. And here we can see that based on this territorial power, many criminal organizations throughout the world are being able to run criminal insurrection, or being able, to go head to head pretty much with states. And this has been the case in feral cities and criminal ghettos throughout the world, in favelas in Brazil, in garrisons in Jamaica, and comunas in Colombia, and ciudades perdidas, sorry for my terrible Spanish accent, in Mexico. And here, which is very interesting, is that states' only option is either to use indiscriminate and brutal force to regain, but always very briefly and superficially, this territory, very often also alienating further local population, or to negotiate with criminal entities. And this is what we have seen also throughout the Sahel, where these criminal entities have become, for again decades now, the providers of job, of security, and social order. Very quickly here, I have, I think, 3 minutes left, Arturo, if I'm correct. 4. Thank you very much. We can mention here also that throughout Africa, the rise of heroin trafficking through East Africa and the growth of cocaine trafficking through West Africa and associated criminal actors have very much taken their root into a failed governance system, as the money that is made by cocaine trafficking, just storing it and reshipping it to mainly Europe, have become one of the most attractive, if not the most attractive, political rent by accessing to political power throughout the Gulf of Guinea, from Senegal to Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, to Nigeria and Cameroon. For a very long time, the most attractive rent was the diversion of international public aid, of public funds, of money from mining or illicit logging. Cocaine has changed that, and again we can see that those phenomenon have directly, perhaps indirectly, been favored, to say the least, by a certain environment caused by structural adjustment programs. Why? Because in reaction to what the IMF and the World Bank has created, the police, the justice system, and even the military were considerably underfunded and understaffed, because again, those were negotiated conditions to obtain the loans. Another element is that the IMF and the World Bank imposed deregulated import-export systems with very weak customs control protocols in ports and airports. In Cotonou, one of the largest, in Lomé, two of the largest ports in the Gulf of Guinea, the custom and police entities have one car there without oil available to them to control the entire port. Another valid example here of the perverse effects of the SAPs would be the smokescreen debate on the role given to increasing austerity and restricting public spending in these countries, again, which highlights a rise in criminal behaviors in the ways local governments are run. So the rise of criminal behavior, I just mentioned it before, the rise of kleptocratic behavior is particularly interesting in the sense that accessing state's position, accessing like power, political power, presidency, head even of some time of the military or security institution became also the way that you would guarantee personal safety, family safety, the protection of your clan or associated traditional authorities. And how would you do so? Mainly by diverting and misappropriating public funding both national and international. And the Trust Africa Foundation, for example, recently reported that more than 100 billion in illicit financial flows, almost 200 billion, according to another study by Judith Kavanagh, leave the African continent to tax havens each year, 200 billion each year, 4 times more than the official development assistance Africa receives. Indeed, many continue to ignore a simple fact. Africa isn't poor, rather systemic injustice and inequalities, corruption and criminal activity, the misappropriation and evasion of public and private funds keep it underdeveloped. And as demonstrated before, SAPs have directly contributed to the increase in bad government practices across Africa. A last example to wrap it up, I think that one of the most visible connection in my studies, in my research between SAPs and criminal activities in Africa is to be found in thriving environmental crimes. And waste trafficking is one of the most revealing cases because it is not an illegal trade per se, but becomes criminal depending on the nature of the actors involved or the methods used to carry out the transactions. It therefore benefits first and foremost from weaknesses in regulation, control, and regulatory authorities, or from the lowering of customs duties, a weakening of the state directly accentuated by SAPs in Africa. It should be noted that Africa is affected by the poor management of the waste produced on its soil, but also by the trafficking of waste, especially toxic waste, mainly from Europe, but also from Asia, the Middle East, and the United States. For example, during a global operation in June 2017, Interpol seized 1.4 million tons of end-of-life products and plastic products with vehicle and computer waste destined for Africa. In Le Havre in France, in September 2017, 15 tons of uncleaned automotive scrap on its way to Senegal was seized by customs. There was an estimate by a committee, one sentence more. There was an estimate that 120,000 tons of toxic waste will be stored in Africa, had been stored in Africa from 2002 to 2016. And what we can see here is that the management of illicit storage for thousands of containers of toxic waste had been made by government to the Nigerian crime syndicates and to local crime syndicates in close relationship with the Ndrangheta, with Cosa Nostra, and with the Camorra. So basically, as a last sentence, we can see here that deregulation of ownership, deregulation of custom duties, lowering of environmental and export controls, corruption in the allocation of operating permits, all of that had been basically that a result of SAPs created a vicious circle that is now considerably affecting the African continent. Thank you very much for your attention and for your time. And thank you again, Arturo, for the invitation.
I do have a question for Word if I...
Okay.
Your presentation really resonated a lot with me. And I was just curious, when you were talking about the case of Indonesia and you talked about these organizations that are not political parties, the ORMAs, I was just very curious about what these are exactly, because I was like, are these the actual criminal groups? But they seem, in your pictures, it actually seems they even have like, you know, flags and like even it looks like uniforms. So it seems like a very interesting form of organization. So I was just curious if you can elaborate a little bit more about that. And, you know, I think the argument you're proposing really resonates a lot with the work I've done to explain violence in Colombia and Mexico. So it will be, that's a lot of interesting discussions there, but I'm really curious about what those organizations are and what is their role, and if these are actually criminal groups or if there is more like a community organization, because it seems like a very particular form of organization.
Thank you, Angelica.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was jumping right in.
Specific question.
Thank you, Angelica, for giving the chance to clarify this, and I'm gonna maybe try to circle back and also have the question to Dennis. Because indeed I didn't elaborate, and indeed these organizations are are a particular form of this criminal governance, which is quite different from the gangs that we have been discussing in say, Brazil and Colombia, and this kind of gangs governance that Dennis was proposing.
Yeah.
Because these are, yes, if I would take your terms, they are a bit in between of a community organization and a criminal organization or a vigilante group. They usually, in their names, many of them have an ethnic, they represent an ethnic group. The Forum Betawi is sort of the Betawi group. You have Batak, and you have all sorts of groups, but they claim to represent a community and their interests, a bit like how I think Dennis was making the point, how they instantiate the community and create coherence. But at the same time, that kind of community representation is also a front or a legitimation for their protection racket activities. There is that ugly side to their work, which finances their work basically, but it's something to be hidden or to be not to give a different front. So and they are really relied upon by the police to maintain order in their neighborhoods. So they are really, in some senses, sometimes an extension of the police to in areas where their capacity is too low, which obviously comes to great benefit for these organizations because they use these connections to boost their own status and power. And it's that link also that allows them these semi-criminal activities and make money out of it because they know the police does not want to disturb the relationship too much. And it's also that what puts the limit on their criminal activity. They cannot be too criminal because then they would risk all these important connections.
Decent criminals. Okay, thank you.
Do you mind if I follow up just so we don't miss him?
Okay, yeah. And then Federico and Dennis have raised their hands too. But
I was just curious also because you mentioned that they are kind of national or regional in nature, whereas in India everything is more localized. So I was just wondering how you reconcile the fact that India, the relationships seem to be much more, in some ways, constant and stronger and kind of more, they stay over time longer. But in Indonesia, they are not, despite the fact that these organizations have more regional, have like a wider regional scope.
Yeah, well, I would say that that's also part, that organizational feature is part of the reason that these relationships are more temporal, that they can negotiate their support of their whole organization, and with that, the promise of a lot of votes, which individual gundas like Mohan Bai cannot. But there's also that electoral system kind of thing that it simply, in Indonesian context, it's unwise to put your eggs in one basket, so to say. While in India, it is a smart thing to do because you cultivate this strong bond that makes it difficult for a politician to break. So that's where my electoral system argument would come in. Yeah, I'd be very curious, but if you can later to hear where you said it resonate, how that electoral system argument would play out in your context.
Yes. Okay, Federico, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also have a short, quick question. Can I lower this thing? On the Indonesian. So on the Indonesian comparison with India. So I was thinking that you said that in Indonesia, they're organized in associations, which make them less territorial, right? But of course, an association can have a local chapter. So you have, like, even the Sicilian mafia is organized in an association of families, but each of them is territorial. So I wasn't, maybe I didn't get it, but I wasn't so clear on why would not necessarily be territorial if you are an association of independent groups. And I think the more general point that I think is useful to make, the more general point, is that and I don't want to be simplistic here, but there are two broad different types of regimes in play here. There is a basic authoritarian regime with kind of fake elections in which, you kind of pretend to elect, but ultimately the state is in charge. And there are broadly democratic liberal regimes. And to me, what is very interesting is to understand whether in the first type, the kind of people you were talking about are really an agent of the state ultimately. I mean, they are working for the state and they derive entirely or almost entirely their ability to do anything from that. And then you move to the kind of extreme scenario, which is the Sicilian scenario, in which these mafias are not an agent of the state. They're autonomous of the state. Now, of course, they operate in a context where the state also exists, right? Obviously, they're not living in the moon. And so if you want a passport in Italy, you have to go to the passport office. It's not that you cannot produce a passport. I mean, unless you have a fake passport. Most people would go to the... So it's not that the fact that you have governance by organized crime in Sicily means that the state is not a part of the equation. It just means that it's not effective or not functioning in a certain domain, which is very important, such as dispute settlement. So to me, that is a key distinction that might actually make the story of India and Indonesia, which is also, I think, a story increasingly of Hong Kong, potentially, very different from the story of, say, Latin America. And finally, of course, an empirical question is that not every single group that is criminal is also a governance group. Of course, I was trying to say at the end of my short talk that some are involved in production, some are involved in trafficking, and it's an empirical question to see which one does what. I mean, I tend to think that there is quite a clear division of labor, which is probably a controversial view. But if you are very good at governance, you are specializing and you tend to do that. And I find also very interesting to study the transition. So the Mexican cartel, as far as I understand, started out as being involved in trafficking, and then they morphed into governance. I think those transitions are really fascinating, but certainly remains a fact that not every single group is doing governance. It's an empirical question to find which one does, and under which conditions the governance increases, decreases, is limited or enhanced by other factors. I did have another point on the presentation on the IMF, but I probably have spoken already too much.
Just go ahead. We have some time. Yeah.
No, the point on the IMF presentation, which I really liked, I thought that resonated with me because the work I did on Russia, so I did a book at some point called The Russian Mafia, and that book was about how the transition to the market economy left, and then the new markets were not properly governed by the new Russian state, and how that led to a demand for protection, which was eventually met by criminal groups. So in a sense, privatization without the rule of law and a well-functioning market, and ultimately without a strong state which governs the market, led to the emergence of mafia-type organization in Russia. And also Gambetta's argument more or less is very similar on the case of the Sicilian mafia. So if you take that argument to the IMF conditionalities, you have to privatize, which is a very broad argument, which might sound, quite sort of extreme in some sense, but I think it does resonate to the fact that the moment you have countries which are basically state managed, you have an economy which is basically run by the state in a sort of pseudo-socialist system in Africa, and then you are overnight forced to privatize. Well, these privatization programs never think about the fact that privatization per se is not enough. You don't simply privatize if you want a well-functioning market economy or if you want a well-functioning capitalist society. You also need a strong state which manages and controls the market. So I think that general argument, of course, it has to be specified country by country, but I think it resonates with the history of the mafia and the emergence of mafias in countries such as Japan, which also has very similar history, privatization, and the end of regime and the emergence of the Yakuza, and Russia, and I think also Mexico with the end of the PRI. So that's why I thought it resonated with my work in a very different context.
We'll start with your question, and then I will answer. I will try to answer or respond to Federico Varese's comments. Thank you, because this is an absolutely crucial point that you're mentioning. I think the best example to answer you is what happened in Nigeria. In Nigeria, you had, as you all know, a conjugation. You had a polygon of crisis, right? In the 70s, you had droughts, you had the war in Biafra, you had a massive famine, you had a number of issues, and then you had very, very severe SAPs that were implemented, which basically meant, Sir Adorno, that zero, it was not, it's very simple. Zero regulation were actually strictly implemented when it came to first trying to filter, to vet different investments, the origin of the money, and the actual use. Second, as the actual regulation of the banking system was completely absent, naturally, Nigerian crime syndicates, especially Igbo from the southwest of Nigeria, that took power, that, you know, they started in cyber, in human trafficking, then they went into cocaine trafficking, then heroin trafficking, etc. So they considerably grew. One of the things with Nigerian crime syndicate is that they are patriotic gangsters. So they reinvest the money they steal back in Nigeria, pretty much. And a lot of Nigeria's developments has actually been linked to the money that Nigerian crime syndicates have actually reinvested in their country. And they have done it through the banking system. And then you have two elements that are actually connected to deregulation. First, the nomination of people at the head of banks and central banks that are very often either connected to organized crime or members of organized crime. And I have one member in my mind where you had a scandal a couple of years ago in the Nigerian central bank that is very likely connected to Nigerian crime, a very large Nigerian crime syndicate that stole over 50 billion of central bank money, 50 billion in one case. So this is the type of money we're talking about. So we're talking here about massive frauds and malversation within the banking system. And then you have the second phenomenon that happens in Cyprus, that happens in Panama, and in many places across the globe, where you have banks that are actually either where you have mafias or organized crime that takes control, you know, from the inside, or that create their own bank. And that happened naturally also in Nigeria. And so the deregulation here is multiple. It is one, again, on vetting the origin of investments. Second, that is naturally completely absent. Second, on the public persona and private persona that you're going to actually push within the system to take responsibilities. And third, on the actual criminalization of governance within, you know, large public institution that is, you know, naturally favoring mafias. And I hope that I answered your question. And you can see that throughout Africa. And I think this is a massive issue because you have rising banking markets and financial markets throughout the continent. And this is really something that we need to follow, I think, for the 21st century. I fully agree with you. Did I answer your question, sir? Yeah? No. Oh, okay. And Senor Varese, to answer to respond to your comment, I think that what we can see here is that it is not only the privatization of you know, I think it is really, again, a correlation of factors. It is the way that, you know, they haven't changed the state. They have destroyed it. I insist on that. Like the IMF and the World Bank, I studied it very precisely. And I can tell you that in Mali or in Cote d'Ivoire or in Tanzania or in Kenya, if you look at the numbers economically, and I think it's the same in India, I think you can see the same phenomenon, as you rightly mentioned, in Mexico, in Colombia, even in Venezuela, actually. What happens here is that you have an entire possibility as a person to expand and to have an actual career and a fulfillment of your immediate needs by the state that is actually closed, that is completely destroyed. Because you are not going to look for the state for a viable education. You're not going to look for the state if you are hurt or if you need any, health treatment. You're not going to look for the state if you need a job opportunity or if you need protection, right? And what happened here is that also it changed the public ethos. And that's what I try to demonstrate, is that it changed the public ethos in the way that accessing to public position became not only a question of enriching yourself and your clan and your family, but it also became a question of protection. It became a question of survival. Because if you wanted to access the only good school privatized, the only privatized good clinic or hospital, the only neighborhood in town that was actually secured, you needed to have control of public position, right? And I think that this moment is critical here, because at this moment you had an entire part of the state that was either indirectly or voluntarily led to the governance of other actors, being Islamic actors, being evangelical actors, being humanitarian actors, Occidental, or criminal. And you can really see the moment, like in time, the moment throughout Africa, like a steep rise of criminal practices and transnational criminal activities following, the implementation of ASAPs. So this, I hope that answered your comments. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Dennis, please, Rogers, please. Yes.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I have a question for Camila. I mean, particularly, one of the things which has always puzzled me with the PCC is the transfer from the prison to the urban context, because in that sense, in Nicaragua, for example, prison gangs aren't very established, and actually what happened is more that the external gangs reorganize people from the same gang hang out in the prison in Nicaragua. Perhaps more interesting is in South Africa, where you had a very separate kind of the numbers gangs who emerged in the prisons, but they had very little, they have no territorial base at all in Cape Town, for example, or Joburg. What has happened, however, over the last kind of 10 years or so, is that as you've seen an increase in the length and the frequency of sentencing of people in South Africa, particularly gang members, the numbers gangs have begun to have more influence on kind of the gangs such as the Junkie Funky Kids, because effectively you need to become a numbers gang member if you go into prison in order to kind of survive. But this doesn't seem to be the case. There's no kind of, there doesn't seem to be a kind of circulation in that sense between two different gangs in Brazil, from what you've said. And so the two questions I have is, presumably when the PCC moved out of the prisons into kind of poor neighborhoods, they encountered other actors there, and how did they deal with them? And then secondly, are there not tensions between the kind of logic of the PCC within the prison and the logic of the PCC in urban neighborhoods?
Okay, thanks for the question, Dennis. I think it's a specific kind of difference from PCC to the other prison gangs, like, for example, the American prison gangs. In PCC, all time stress their unity. There's no difference between prisoners. I think it's a very, very important thing, because different from the, for example, American prison gangs, that they are divided by race, symbols, colors, and things like that. PCC stressful the equality between all prisoners and their sharing experience of incarceration to get action together. When they return to their community after serving their sentences, they're starting to live in the same ethics, principles, norms that they run the prisons, govern the prison to these communities. Because in São Paulo, the poor neighborhoods and the prisons, they are the same. They are the same prison that live in poor neighborhoods and go to prison. Then they go and return. Their families. It's all around the prisons. Try to make the prison services that our families less hard. Take food for the prison. Take some elements to facilitate the time in prisons. And PCC has a great successful and to construct order in prisons. Before PCC, the Brazilian prisons, there are a lot of rape, a very, very strong violence, very homicides. PCC reduced very, very much all this conflict, violent conflict. Then they kind of transport this form of one prisons to the neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, especially in São Paulo. Why I stress this is in São Paulo, because the presence of PCC in other states of Brazil, especially in North and Nordest, provoke violent disturbed, because in these other places, there are a lot of other groups that not think it's good, the control by PCC. In São Paulo, I think there is a sum of elements that construct an order and the interdependence dynamic between prison and the street that makes construct a cycle of reciprocal of this the two territory. And there is I think is a very interesting thing that in São Paulo is different, for example, from Rio de Janeiro. In São Paulo, there is no a territory army control by PCC. The favelas in São Paulo, if you go to a favela, you probably will not perceive the control by PCC because it's not a visible control. It's different from Rio de Janeiro, for example, that are army soldiers in every kind of the favela places to protect the territories. Surely, because of the hegemony in PCC, there is no other group to menace their territories. Because of this, there is no army. You don't see the arms. PCC in São Paulo, they said they only use their fire guns to robbery, to their work on robbery, especially the great robber, like robbers and some sites like the complex robbers. In the drug trafficking in São Paulo, for example, in the place where the drugs and retail is sell, there is no arm, there is no gun. Because there is they call this the pacification of the crime in São Paulo. I think PCC transport this from prison to these neighborhoods. I think it's a kind of government, a criminal government that has been successful and is interesting for all the people, for people who live in these neighborhoods, for the prisons, for the prisoners, and for the government, because I don't have here the graphic of the homicides in São Paulo, but you have to believe me that it's a phenomenon very known in Brazil. From 1999, from here, has a decrease of 80% of homicides in São Paulo. It's a very, very important phenomenon. Obviously, the government says this is a politic of public security, but there is no example of a political security public that explains this, how there's decrease of homicides. For me, it's clear that this government by PCC in São Paulo allowed this, that the criminal dynamics became more or less violent. PCC, I think it's not time to deep this kind of this question here, but PCC established a form of regulation that they call debate. They they discuss when there is conflict, they discuss between them to see if who is right, who is wrong, and to decide how to punish this kind of wrong action. Then there is no more that cycle of violence and an individual kill each other. PCC get success and interrupt this cycle. I think because of this is a criminal govern successful. But of course, there are some kind of limits because when PCC expanded, they lost his embeddedness, social and cultural. Then they provoke extremely violent in other places where they act. I don't know if I respond to your questions, Dennis.
Thank you, Camila. We have a list of questions. Is Guillaume, and then Ward, and then Angelica, and then me. So please,
thank you.
Guillaume.
Thank you, Camila. I was going to ask you also a question on that, and I think you answered like very well, exactly what I wanted to know about, which is the PCC kind of central capacity to regulate a territory and to be a justice provider and to be a security provider. And it resonates what you tell me right now. A lot, we know in France, when you had social unrest in the French suburbs, in the last 20 years, in every single suburb that is actually controlled territorially by the French criminal network, there was not a single problem in the ground, not a single problem, not a single violence. So yeah, I think what you're mentioning here right now is a testimony also of that. I think that, and it comes back to the criminal enclaves, I think, around the world right now, when they do have the sovereign power more and more. My question was to Angelica. In your work, have you noticed in Colombia or throughout South America, in my research, I came across, the increased presence naturally of African organized crime throughout South America, but also of Balkanese organized crime, Albanese representing people from also Italian representatives of present in Colombia or in Venezuela. Naturally, Mexican cartels also coming south. Has this, I would say, external criminal interference impacted the way organized crime is run, or is perhaps the different layers of organized crime present in I don't know if my question is clear. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay.
Should I answer that one, Arturo?
Yeah, it's just a specific question to you.
Okay, I'll just answer that one. So, I tend to be a little bit on the skeptical side on this question a little bit because I think it tends to be exaggerated a lot by individual cases. I will say yes. So there is always, inevitably, especially when we're talking about drug trafficking, right? It's a transnational business, so it requires connections. So Mexican organizations have had, you always see reports of Mexican organizations having a presence in different Latin American countries. And then you see reports of it was Colombians in the past that will be like the headlines, right? Like Colombians have presence in Argentina. I do think, of course, all the news and the discussion has been dominated recently by Mexican presence in different places. I will say that there is a little bit more than that in the past, I would say 5 years, and that has to do with, for example, we hear more of the PCC in different parts of Latin America. We hear more of like a translation or a movement between Colombia and Venezuela, for example. Now, I will say there is a difference between saying there are actors of these organizations, whether those organizations actually have territorial control and the ability, and I think this goes back to a point that Federico made a while ago about like what it means for somebody to move, and your work, Federico, has explored many of these things, right? So one thing is somebody going to another location because they just need to make sure that the business is working, right? It's business contacts. And another very different one is where they have actually a control and the ability to impose and change dynamics. I think there's been a lot of discussion that in the past years, the presence of Mexican trafficking organizations has changed dynamics across Latin America. I think probably there is a little bit of that, but I'm still very much convinced that how those influences work depends on local conditions, right? So there has been more presence, there have been a report of Mexicans in Colombia, for example, but Mexicans don't have the ability or the interest to control a place as complex as Colombia with such long trajectories of criminal organizations, right? They may be more able to impose that control and change things maybe in other places where there is less of a presence. So I think my short answer to your question is, yes, there is a little bit of this. There is more of these like complex international connections that happens. However, they tend to be exaggerated. And these reports, I think, in and of themselves cannot be ever taken as evidence that there is an actual transplantation of organizations or an actual influence, even if certainly, and I think I will just close by saying that I think that there is a local event in Colombia that is having like a ripple effect across the region, which is the mobilization of the FARC that has opened spaces for different groups to kind of move. So the PCC is moving more into Colombia, like there's like all these very complicated dynamics between Colombia and Venezuela. But it is less of like these big reports of like, you know, Al-Qaeda is having alliances with Mexican organizations. I think that that tends to be driven by very specific reports of a guy who was captured somewhere making business contacts.
Thank you very much.
Great. Ward, please, you have a question or a comment?
I have a response to Federico's questions, which were very nice, and I'll try to address them in the kind of broad comparative spirit that was in the question, particularly about the relationship between regime type and governance. Federico asked, shouldn't we make a distinction between democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes that kind of rely on these criminal groups to kind of maintain control and suppress dissent? I think that's relevant. I was wondering whether you made that comment with your Russian work in mind. But I would say that both India and Indonesia fall into the into the democratic category. Although Indonesia is an interesting one, where you had these vigilante groups during the Suharto era, and then they were these kind of instrument in the way that you mentioned. But then they transitioned into the Indonesia's democratic era, where they became these kind of ad hoc negotiated tools of power holders, and very much extracting their own benefits, and not a very reliable tool anymore for anybody. But, and that's the second point I want to make in relation to Guillermo's point, I mean, the overall, what our cases have in common, I think, is this theme of how criminal organizations take up gaps in the functioning of the state and try to compensate for or make use of weaknesses of state organizations, partly generated by the structural reforms that Guillaume discussed. And this is particularly the case, I think, if these public criminals in Indonesia, who they are, I think and that's the other point that Federico made, we have discussed criminal groups that really are criminal and that take up certain governance tasks to kind of legitimize or to improve their image and to make things easier. But the Preman and the Guna are really a creature of these limited capacities of the state. Like they can do the things that they do, and they can emerge because both the police and other authorities need to cultivate their connections. So this kind of protection record that I showed the clip of, the only way that could work is because the shopmaker knows that this guy has the police behind him. It makes no sense to lodge a case or to complain to the police about that kind of extortion. So I think that's the cool thing of this workshop, that we're discussing these relationship between crime and governance, which has this interaction effect, which is very important to discuss. One final comment, and indeed, Federico pointed out that I formulated not clearly about territorial. These vigilante groups, they operate in different areas, and in that sense, they're not local, but they are territorial in the way that it really matters which areas they control. And you can see if you would move through Jakarta, certain flags of certain vigilante groups really marking that territorial control. It's just spread through the city. That's the difference.
Okay, thank you. You also had a question from the public that you answered through the text, but I just want to mention that thing is from Roberto Briceño, how to understand and use public violence as a tool and at the same time have so little violence in those countries. Roberto Briceño. Huh?
Yeah, can he speak? Because it's a
yeah,
nice
yeah,
point.
you can just comment, I think. I mean, actually, there is a different type of violence in those countries too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question because it points at this important difference between the Asian context and the Latin American context.
And Latin American context, yeah.
And that's very different. And I try to answer, at least in a way, saying that this violence of the Preman Gunda type is really performative. They need to have the image of being violent and dangerous. But if they're successful Preman and Gunda, they don't need to constantly enact it. And I made the point that I made that elsewhere, the argument that this is one reason why I think these types are very much in front when there are riots, which is a very common type of violence in Asia of between communal groups, that this is a stage for these actors to perform and to obtain that image. But once you have that image, if you're good, you don't need this kind of violence at all. And I think it might have, well, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I would put back the question to, say, Dennis and Angelica, who studied gangs more, why the territorial divisions that are so clear in parts of Jakarta do not lead to that much violence, while in cities in Latin America, there seems to be constant turf wars. I think that some of the answer in that might lie there, but they would know better than me.
Thank you very much. Okay, Angelica, you had another question.
I actually have, if you allow me, Arturo, I wanted to make a couple of comments, and actually
Yes.
this is start by reflecting.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Reflecting on what you just said, Ward, and how that. So the reason I was saying your work does resonate with me is because in the way I have explained, and I've focused on explaining violence. You know, why some groups are more violent than others, but like a core part of my argument, my reflection has been that when states and criminal groups can forge stable relationships, those are in those cases where you have less violence, less public violence, particularly. But that this depends crucially on the structure of the state, and that structure depends on electoral dynamics, relationships between different levels of government, and relationship between government agencies. So to me, it makes complete sense that in the case where you see a little bit less competition, which is the Indian one, you will see more stable relationships, right? And again, I guess in my mind, so for example, that's the whole story of the PRI in Mexico, but the story of the PRI in Mexico losing power and fragmenting electorally is also a story of more competition between different sectors of state forces, police forces. And it's also a story of lack of coordination between government levels. And that's also partially a story for why in Colombia, even though there is a lot of collusion, that collusion has never been as centralized, because in some ways crime kind of emerged within a very fragmented state that was also competitive electorally. So I do think the whole story of political competition. Now, for your question about Asia and Latin America, I've been thinking about that. And I think, and we will have to look at this more systematically. I think it has to do with the nature of the groups. It seems to me that in Asia, the criminal groups tend to be much more kind of familiar-based networks that then expand, which I don't think that is the case very often in Latin America, as much as they are community-based and territorial. I don't think they're attached to ethnic, and I think the ethnic component also may play a role in this whole story. I just think the nature of the groups is different, and it makes different the operation of criminal groups, but also in another way, I think with all the limitations, Latin American context, the democracies and the electoral systems and electoral competition is much more complex than in Asia. So I think that that may play, that's the way I've been thinking about this without doing systematically, but I think those are like the two things that may lead us to some kind of explanation for why Latin America is, or crime in Latin America is so much more violent than it is in Asia. I feel like I will just say three things very quickly because just kind of reflecting on this. So as we're thinking about governance, I always think that there are two other concepts that come in, right? But don't always come in when we're talking about groups governing their territories, and those are order and legitimacy. So we have one category of governance that does generate order and does generate legitimacy at some level, right? Even if very contradictory, but not all forms of governance do that, right? And not even for the state. Not all states are orderly and legitimate, even if they have some kind of governance. So that maybe as we think at different types of governance and behavior of criminal groups, it may be interesting to think about whether these three things are overlapping or not in what groups are doing, right? The PCC seems to be more successful in doing governance, gaining order, and being legitimate, but that's not the case for all the groups, right? So the other thing I wanted to, and I think Sergio mentioned this in his comments, is that sometimes one thing I'm concerned about, and you're right, Sergio, when you look back at all the production about crime in the 70s and 80s, you do see like more kind of, it's anecdotes, but that they do tell us that groups have been doing this for a while. It's probably becoming more prevalent and more noticeable now. And even in the case of Mexico, even though I think groups are being more complex now, I will argue that some of the old drug trafficking organizations did engage in forms of governance. They regulated behaviors, they mediated disputes, so that I think it's one risk that we may have sometimes is assuming that something is new just because we are able to document it better now, and assuming that there is something new that is creating that dynamic. And just my last comment for the discussion is, Guillaume, I like the fact that you went back to like the big picture of a structural adjustment. I think that's very important. And I really like, basically a whole argument resonates with me. The one thing I kind of question is, and I like Sullivan's and Grillo's work, but I've been kind of critical of the label criminal insurgency, because what it may entail politically, and the tendency to then label everything when criminals get more power or become more visible, that becomes insurgent. And then along with the idea of insurgency comes a whole lot of tools of policing. Now, I don't think that any of the terms we use is free of problems. Even when I talk about organized crime, every time I use organized crime or I talk about criminal groups in Latin America, I take a big sip of water, because it's like I know I'm kind of minimizing something that is very complex. But in the case of criminal insurgency, I do tend to believe that is a label that is as complicated as saying criminal groups are terrorists, for example. So just a reflection to put out there.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to jump in, but Federico and Dennis also want to intervene. So please go ahead, Federico.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to speak so much. Again, a few reflections on what we just said. So starting with what Ward was saying, he was saying whether my original question to him was somewhat coming from my work on Russia. Actually, it's more work that I did with a co-author on Hong Kong and China. So another context which we haven't touched upon is China, and I think the increasing authoritarianism in Hong Kong. And there is this concept called thugs for hire, So I think it's not exactly, wouldn't fit your context, but it's sort of the extreme version of the opposite of the mafia. So these are situations in which the state doesn't want to appear as doing the nasty thing. So it almost gives uniforms to these who are really thugs that are in the underworld, assume this function briefly and then go back. So it's been used a lot in China to discuss decisions to remove, to destroy homes, and because these people have legitimate claims to their homes, the state is in cahoot with the developers, so these thugs do it. So that's what I was thinking of. I still would like to hold this distinction between basically authoritarian societies like China or Russia, especially in the Soviet Union, and basically more democratic ones. I also agree very much with Angelica. That's how we would say in Italian. Maybe that's not the Spanish pronunciation. So I also read a lot about the story of the Mexicans going to Colombia. And it seems very much along the line that she was saying, obviously knowing more than I do, that it seems more like people who go there for business contacts. So as opposed to be governance, to me, it is trading. So you trade, so you have to go and check on your investment. And since it's an informal investment, you cannot just do it necessarily as we are doing now through Zoom. So you have to be physically present. So there are very significant signs of Mexicans in Colombia, like I think the son of El Chapo was there, that some of them have been arrested. But to say that the Mexicans are controlling Colombia's production would be crazy, I think. It would be so complicated that it seems very, very hard to imagine. And finally, also I thought it's very interesting, the question of why is Mexico so violent and Latin America as opposed to Asia, which again, I think is a macro question. And Angelica was giving one answer to do with this organization of the groups and the familial connections. So, I mean, certainly the question of Mexico is interesting because these cartels were new in some sense. I mean, I agree that there were some small governance before, but the market for governance expanded exponentially after the and after the transition from, the Colombians now being less important. So in a sense, they had to establish their reputation for violence. And that's why you see this incredible level of violence. I mean, from the point of view that I can see, it's not surprising that you have the Zetas and doing these extremely gruesome things because they have to set themselves up as being very violent. Once you set yourself up as a reputable violent organization, then you can save on violence. So that to me was one element which you don't see in Asia. And obviously drugs, I think, I mean, the money involved in drugs is so much more than it's in any other governance situation. Like even Sicily doesn't have that drugs dimension that it used to have. And I also agree on the issue of criminal insurgency. I think the concept that I really find useful, and I end here as a testament to this fantastic seminar, is the concept of governance, I think. And so you want to govern. So ultimately, when you govern, you need to be the only one who governs. And so you fight with the neighbors. And if you want to establish your reputation, you fight a lot. And to me, that is the best way to capture this phenomena, which are, however, as we all said, there is variation within the broad concept. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, no, I wanted to pick up on Ward's question about why urban divisions in, say, Jakarta don't lead to violence in the same way as that the urban divisions in, say, Rio or wherever do. I think Angelica is right to say, yeah, the nature of the groups are different, but I think it's in a very particular way. It's about the relation to the state as well. I mean, the Ormas in many ways are subordinate to the Indonesian state. I mean, they align themselves with a kind of a state ideology. And in that sense, a lot of their action is about kind of reaching up or kind of aligning themselves with the state. So there's a kind of commonality there. Whilst I think you don't necessarily have that so much in kind of Latin American cities, but you can sometimes. I mean, in Nicaragua, for example, the height of criminal violence in Nicaragua was in the kind of in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s, and it's when drugs had the drugs trade had institutionalized, and you had kind of local cartel-like organizations which were fighting it out to kind of control market shares first, and then afterwards kind of transport routes. That violence collapsed when the state took it over. And so, I mean, Nicaragua is a narco state, which is with the drugs trade controlled by the kind of government. In that sense, that's the major explanation why you actually have lower levels of drug-related violence there. I think that links into kind of a point which is in the question and answer session, which Don Weening brought up, and I'll say hi, Don, about kind of the kind of what is the nature of violence? Does violence need to occur in a particular way in order for it to be a tool of governance, or kind of to reflect some form of governance? I think the first thing is really important that we are still operating in a kind of context where there is a kind of antithetical relationship made at some level between governance and violence. I mean, even though we know this is pardon my French, a load of bullshit. The fact is, the matter is that we are still very much kind of, there's this kind of ethical kind of thing that if it's violent, it's not proper governance. But I also think that, you know, violence can be a tool of governance, a form of governance in very different ways. There's a wonderful book which was written in the 70s by French anthropologist called Pierre Clastre about the organization of violence in Amazonian society. It was called La Société contre l'État, Society Against the State, where he develops kind of, he looks at different forms, the different ways in which violence is deployed to achieve different forms of organization. He contrasts centripetal forms of organization, so groups that were trying to stay independent as small groups, versus more centrifugal forms of organization which brought groups together and united them into kind of bigger units. I mean, they're both forms of governance, and violence is very core to both ideas, but it plays out in very different ways. So I think this is, to me, one of the most important things in this workshop, which I think reflect in the papers, is that there's a real need to unpack this kind of idea of criminal violence, but not just from the criminal side of things, but also from the governance side of things. And part of what I was trying to say in the paper is a way that you can make a kind of parallel between, say, the kind of gang governance of the 90s and the Sandinista state of the 80s, and then the standard story would be, well, the gang stopped being nice and protecting the neighborhood became predatory. But you have the same story happening with state governance as well. And so in that sense, we need to kind of get away from these kind of very charged labels. I mean, in some ways, we were discussing, we all hate the idea of criminal insurgency because it's a kind of terrible label which has got kind of political implications. But I think criminal governance has a similar kind of thing as well. We kind of lump all these different organizations, all these different iterations of governance into one label, some of which, you know, until we unpack that idea of governance and make it less technical but more a political thing, then we will always kind of be struggling around, is violence good or bad here, or what kind of violence is good governance violence, or what kind of violence is not good governance violence.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to add some overall comments into the presentations that all were great. I mean, I'll start with this idea of the governance. What we have been discussing is that there is not one single way of understanding governance. I mean, the political scientists have concentrated a lot on the relationship with the state sovereignty and legitimacy. But where we're looking today is that there are forms of societal or governance that are embedded in different types of economical arrangements as well as political arrangements. So this calls for a discussion of the concept or a single definition of the concept that includes only the political realm, okay? Then there is this discussion that Federico also pointed out, I mean, that can be folded into things. Of course, this has consequences on the idea of legitimacy. For me, before talking about legitimacy, we should talk about consent, because several of these forms are not consensual. I mean, I got into a neighborhood where there is controlled by a gang, but different from a state that I can discuss, I cannot just challenge easily this order, no? So you had to consent. I mean, and citizens in several of these neighborhoods are subject to two different sovereigns. I mean, on the one hand, the government, that is also very authoritarian, corrupt, and weak. And on the other side, they are controlled by these gangs. So it creates a very complex interaction between not only the government and the crime organizations, but also citizens. They have to really manage their lives into very complex dual types of activities in the economic, employment, etc. This is the second thing. The third one is about, I mean, what is discussing is, what has been discussed is about the political arrangements on crime, particularly Ward was speaking about this thing. Looks like fragmentation is one thing that is happening in several places where there is increasing intervention of criminal organizations into this thing. There is a new book of Sandra Leyan Trejo in Mexico that is trying to make a broader explanation of the interaction of criminal organizations into the political realm. And I'm trying to explain how those they, I mean, why did this became so violent and what types of problem they have. And one argument of the book is fragmentation, both at the political parties, but on the other side, the fragmentation of government, which on the one hand can be an explanation, but on the other hand it's something that you have to take into consideration. I mean, the more decentralized, the more fragmented, the more, I mean, you will have different types of authorities that have different capacities. The point is, why does some of these things become so violent? And I will just give a little word of warning on the violence. If we look at the data on Latin America in cities and in regions throughout the last 30 years, Mexico is not the most violent country. I mean, you can just look at the data. I mean, and even if you go into cities, I mean, as Camila was saying, Sao Paulo is a very peaceful city today, but still, the homicide rate is very high, one thing, comparing to other cities in Latin America. I mean, for instance, against Medellin and Mexico City, just, it's not as bad as Rio today, but it's high. And second, there is another type of violence that is strong, and this is another comment that I wanted to make, that is police violence. And we haven't mentioned, I think this is something important to take into consideration in our questions, our situation studies research. What types of police interactions do we look when we look at criminal actors and the state? What are the public actors that are interacting in here? And police has a wide variety of forms of intervention, relation, cooptation, control in these cities and in several regions, I mean, depending on the organization of the states in Latin America.
I would say that I really like very much of our discussion. I think we are a lot of topics to expand and deeply our understanding and to compare the very different context and the difference in Latin America and the difference between Latin America and other places, or Europe and Asia. I am very thankful to you for the invitation. I think we can later deep that difference and the connection between the governance and the violence related to the fragmentation and with the connection between the criminal actors and the state actor. I think in Brazil and other places, it's a very, very important thing. How, as you like, Arturo, how the police act, how the police violence. For example, in Rio de Janeiro last year, homicides committed by police represent almost 40% of total homicide of Rio de Janeiro. It's a very, very, very high. And I think it is a central piece to understand why Latin America is so violent.
That is correct.
I think I am grateful, and I will send you for the mail some publication that I have in English, because I think the book what is in the our works in the seminar that is in Portuguese, but I will send it for all of you to we can discuss some tests in English for our discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed. We can share some of our more recent work on this topic. And as you will say, I mean, there are also other topics that were not addressed, not only police. I think we have to expand more on what is happening to prisons in other regions of the world today and how they are becoming a complex problem of governance. There are other areas that we didn't even talk about, the Middle East, for instance, and then connections not only with terrorism and other activities that has an interface with these larger criminal organizations in the illicit trades. So there are other topics that has to be discussed in order to broaden the idea of governance and also look at other places like Federico was talking about China. China is the main contributor of piracy products in Latin America. It's not that we produce them, we just import them from China because they are very cheap, as well as precursors for drugs. So this country, I mean, has to be understood and put into the picture, as well as some other places like big markets for these illicit activities. Anyway, if you don't have any more comments or any questions, I will like to thank you all for your presentations. I will write soon to you, making some other comments of your presentations. If you have some written papers, I would like to read them. And then in the follow-up in the next weeks or months, I would like to speak about the possibility of building up a book, a broader discussion for a book, a collective book in the future, okay?
Thank you, Arturo, for organizing, and thank you,
Thank
Emilia.
you.
Thank you.
Very
Have
nice.
a good time.
Thank you, everyone.